Ladies and gentlemen, today is 4/20/2025, and we are here to talk about the world. Current events, foreign policy, economics, you name it, we'll talk about it in another episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Smith.
Hello.
Yo.
Hey, how are you?
Doing well, yourself?
Oh, can't complain.
We have been crushing the Dota recently, which has been hype. I got promoted twice since we've last talked. So I went from Legend 3 to Ancient 1. So you advance 5 times through each bracket, and we went from the third one to the lowest level of the next bracket. And I feel like I had a breakthrough in a lot of my fundamentals and understanding how to macro in Dota, how to increase your net worth in a safe way for lots of different game states. It's hard to have one plan that fits all the different scenarios, but if you have a versatile and cautious plan, you're less likely to get killed and you keep your momentum going. Anytime you get killed, it's like a penalty box in hockey. Dota is a lot like hockey in that sense, where instead of a foul gets you dead, it's the enemy team killing you that gets you in the penalty box for a period of time. So the other team has a power play, basically. And that happens all the time in Dota. And my job is to play carry. So I prefer position 1, which needs to farm the most, and they should be the richest at the end of the game. And I've been working on Terrorblade. He's an illusion hero who scales one of the best in the game, like top 3 in the game, for his stat growth over time. And because he makes a bunch of illusions of himself, those also benefit from his damage output increasing with gold and with items. So that guy I basically figured out. I pulled him up from about 40% win rate maybe a month ago, and now he's a 60% win rate hero for me. Just by playing super duper defensive. By telling myself I'm going to blow my cooldowns in the jungle where no one can see me instead of trying to bring them to a fight. Because the weakness of the hero that I'm trying is he dies to like 2 magic spells early on. He's super flimsy to magic. So he wants to avoid all the early scuffles. And it's no cowardice on his part. Like, you're supposed to play the hero that way. You're not supposed to go in and dive. And a lot of teams make a mistake of attacking when you shouldn't. So I basically said, I'm not helping my team unless it looks really easy and good for me. I'm just going to keep farming. And it's been a huge improvement. So that upswing has been fun. I haven't had the chance to play the new patch yet. I don't know what we want to do after our world discussion, but that's something we can workshop and I don't know, maybe play around a HOTS or 2 or something. But we did complete our honor mode run last week, which we can brag about for a little bit. That was sick. Honor mode is very, very hard. It's very hard, and the second time through, it's still hard. But we got it.
Yeah, I thought the final fight went pretty well.
I agree. We even killed the dragon, which in my previous run, we just avoided it. And we just threw that ads back there and then just tried to rush the portal and let the mess kind of develop. But we didn't have as many allies. In this run, you and I did every quest. So everyone who you could possibly have on your side, we had on our side. I think maybe except for the deep gnomes. I don't think we had them.
Yeah, we didn't have the deep gnomes, and we also didn't have Roland. Because he disappeared in Act 2 for some reason.
Mm-hmm. Don't remember if we found his body or something, but yeah.
But yeah, we definitely were able to kind of go with the minion approach.
Mm-hmm.
We crowded the field.
We brought extra scrolls of Conjure Elemental from the Sorceress Sundry's shop, which his character was banned from for trying to steal stuff. So I have to go in and do the shopping because he's in trouble. He's not allowed within 20 feet of this perimeter. And he's like, sorry. But he's mostly a good character. Swami's Riki.
I should say I deserve that label. I made a big sacrifice at the end of that game.
You did. You did. And it will be taught to all Githyanki for all time. So that's actually pretty huge. You're the most historic of all the characters in terms of staying power. And then if you don't want spoilers, I guess you should have left a bit ago. But I can avoid spoilers. But I got to have a good outcome with Minthara. It's pretty cool. I told my brother about it, and he was like, "You decided to rule the city?" And I was like, "What? Someone needs to administrate." So
fair point.
Great game, 10 out of 10, best game in the last 10 years. World stuff, yeah, this is a world news segment, but catching up on IRL stuff is always fun.
Yeah.
You have maps for us. There was one map that was already done for last world discussion, but we had a lot of stuff and didn't even get to it. So, yeah, you have more maps for us too. I think it's like 3. I'll have to download and organize them when I'm between games.
Actually, it's just 2. Okay. The one I sent you 2 in your personal Discord. One of them is the same one from last week, and the other one is just an updated version of that takes into account the 90-day delay in tariffs as well as the exemptions and whatnot. And the second graph is much more boring than the first, since with the 90-day delay, everybody is at 10% tariffs now, except for China. So I mostly just made the second graph to show the dichotomy between the announced tariffs and what they actually look like right now.
Gotcha. Well, cool. I'm ready to dig into this. So this is tariffs part 2. Is there anything else you wanted to kind of get into before the tariff stuff?
There's other stuff going on. Marine Le Pen was banned from politics for 5 years. There's a bunch of Trump stuff. The Garcia drama / scandal, depending on your perspective. Hundreds more students have their visas revoked. The Insurrection Act may be in the news next week, pretty soon. State Department getting reorganized. There's a standoff with Harvard. There's nuclear talks with Iran. And TPS status was revoked for Afghans, Cameroonians, and then another group that I don't have in my notes, but I remember there was a third. Beyond that, more drama in Africa, like civil war in Sudan is ongoing, Zimbabwe compensating farmers, more fighting in Rwanda, in eastern DR Congo. The conservative candidate won re-election in Ecuador. And I think those are the main ones.
That's some pretty major shit. What's this Insurrection Act thing?
So basically there's 3 bills that were passed way back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, that the Trump administration's people want to try to use in order to deport people. One of them is the Alien Enemies Act. That's the one that's relevant to the Garcia case that is ongoing, and that's been in the news prominently for the past week. Another one is the Insurrection Act, which basically gives the government police powers during emergencies.
Gotcha.
And allows the deployment of the U.S. military inside the United States. There are very narrow circumstances in which it could be done without the Insurrection Act, that is to say, deployment of U.S. military in the United States. But the Insurrection Act basically just makes it blanket allowed in order to deal with whatever emergency is ostensibly necessitating it. So presumably, the Trump administration wants to try to use that to deploy military assets, probably to the border, one assumes, but it could hypothetically go elsewhere, depending on how they want to define the ostensible emergency that would be used to justify the usage of the Insurrection Act. Alien Enemies Act basically just allows the government to deport like terrorists and whatnot. So they've been trying to use that to get rid of people they're labeling gang members, specifically members of gangs that have already been declared terrorist organizations. That happened back in January. So obviously they're kind of bending that law in order to expedite deportations. With the Insurrection Act, they're looking more to use the military to expedite deportations by presumably using them to catch more people along the border, or perhaps to assist in arrests, or God knows what else. You know, it's a pretty wide-ranging set of powers the Insurrection Act would give them. So I'm sure they'll come up with something very creative and controversial that we'll be reading about if and when it happens. I don't remember what the third bill was off the top of my head, Maybe somebody in chat remembers. I'll throw out the usual disclaimer early today, like we did last time. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. I have more of a background in economics and foreign policy. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, let me know. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So participation by chat is encouraged. We do enjoy and benefit from the feedback we get from people, both here in Twitch chat and on YouTube comments.
True.
And I won't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. I always go back through. Always interesting, informative, and not infrequently entertaining.
Thanks, commenters and chatters.
Okay, so that said, part 2 of the tariff drama.
Oh, before you start, I did have a message from chat. They said, we love Agent Smith, and I wasn't sure if it was platonic or romantic, but just keep that in your notes.
For their sake, let's hope it's platonic. They're not going to want any of this if they saw it in person.
He's humble.
So let's see. Okay, so how are we going to do this? So the way I've organized it, I'm going to go through some updates that have happened over the past week, and some of it's actually stuff that happened before that I didn't really have an obvious place for, so I'm going to put it here. Once we do the update, then we'll pick up where we left off last time when we were talking about the reciprocal tariffs that were announced. We already went through all of the details about the tariffs, what they are, what they're intended to do, and specifically how they're designed. So this time, we're going to be talking more about critique, winners and losers, stuff like that. It'll be a little more abstract this time. And that'll probably take up a very good chunk of our time, I would guess. So, that said, to start with the update, it won't surprise anybody to know that there's been more retaliation from China. Specifically, the retaliation took the form of China implementing restrictions on the importation of U.S. movies. There was already pretty strict restrictions on the flow of U.S. media into China. I think it was something like only 10 movies from Hollywood were allowed a year, which is not a lot considering Hollywood's output. But now they're going to presumably curb that further. They've been a little cagey on the details of just how much they'll curb it, or whether they might even block it off entirely. But they did announce that those restrictions would come into play. I had some background data on this. Hollywood films only account for about 5% of the overall box office receipts in China's market. It used to be larger, but the Chinese media landscape has changed dramatically over the past 10 years. Chinese movie makers have improved the quality of their products significantly over that time, and at this point, it's mostly indigenous movies that are dominating the market now. It's also important to note that Hollywood studios only receive about 25% of ticket sales to their movies in China. There's a lot of local partner requirements that require anybody doing business in China to have a local partner when they do it. And that local partner generally gets a good chunk of the revenue from whatever project they're partnering on. Movies are no different. And as part of the strict regime governing the importation of Hollywood movies into China, they can only get about a quarter of the revenue from those movies. And then since 2020, Chinese-made films have consistently accounted for around 80% of annual box office revenue. So pretty much what I said before. So I guess the data there just kind of illustrates that while this is going to be something of a problem for Hollywood, it's not going to be a backbreaker. They've already been kind of losing market share over time, and the amount of revenue that they got has correspondingly shrunken over time. So they'll take a hit, but it's not as bad as it would have been if this had happened, say, 10 years ago or so, when Hollywood movies were banking in significantly greater revenue than they are now. Okay, so some stuff on negotiations. Of course, the Trump administration decided to pick a fight with the entire planet, and so they're negotiating with the entire planet over new trade deals, quote unquote. And I would put a big fat asterisk next to trade deals, since I'm extremely skeptical that they're going to be able to actually negotiate real trade agreements here. Mind you, it generally takes 5 to 10 years to negotiate like actual free trade agreements. And from what I've been reading, the Trump administration wants fairly short-term returns on this, which says to me that these agreements are going to be very superficial. So that said, Japan has been a priority. The administration itself says that because Japan did not retaliate to the tariffs and has been making an earnest, good faith effort to try to negotiate, they're going to receive priority. Whether or not they actually receive priority, anybody's guess, but that's what the admin is saying. So some of the early returns, there were a couple meetings this past week. The first of which, I guess there's only one major meeting to report on, so let me specify that. That was the first actual meeting between a trade envoy from Japan and admin officials. And much to everybody's surprise, Donald Trump himself actually interceded into that negotiation. Nobody's entirely sure why, because the thing about the meeting this past week is that it was actually just a preliminary meeting. They weren't actually negotiating anything of substance. They were just kind of laying out early positions, schedule, that kind of stuff. So it seems like, at least for Japan, Trump seems to have a particular interest. As far as strategy, Japan is hoping to limit the scope of the talks to trade and investment matters. They don't want to talk about other areas in the trading relationship. The Trump administration, in turn, does want to talk about other aspects of the relation. Sorry, not the trading relationship, other aspects of the general relationship between the United States and Japan. Specifically, Trump has said that he wants to talk about greater funding from the Japanese government to pay for U.S. troops that are stationed in Japan. Interestingly, exchange rates have not been brought up. Donald Trump himself has complained about alleged currency manipulation by Japan as something he wants to tackle, but thus far in the talks, it hasn't been brought up. Japan, as part of its strategy here, is going to try to pledge to expand investment in the United States. It's not clear if there's going to be actual follow-through to that. Earlier precedent suggests that countries that promise to do this don't generally follow up that much, and that the United States doesn't really punish them much for not doing so. So this could be like a superficial win that the admin claims, and thus a superficial concession that counterparties can cheaply make without substantive consequence. That said, one possible specific investment that they could use is a gas project in Alaska. I think this is a project that's already kind of in the making, but they could repackage it as something new, as being a quote-unquote concession made to the Trump administration. So let's see. Basically, Japan then is going to try to limit talks to trade issues and is going to promise greater investment of some kind in the United States. The Trump admin is going to push for greater trade concessions, specifically regarding regulatory regime and U.S. agriculture, and is going to try to expand the talks to encompass other areas, either in order to get greater concessions on trade or concessions on those other areas. So what's the forecast look like? So from what I read, the Trump administration, like I said earlier, probably wants a quicker deal, which is going to translate to a less substantive deal. Success will depend probably, given what we know now, on how controversial U.S. demands end up actually being. Agriculture and auto regulations are fairly sensitive. These are the kinds of issues that take a lot of negotiation and a lot of back and forth and a lot of concessions in order to get traction on. If you want an example of that, consider the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. The Obama administration wanted that to be a major cornerstone of the U.S. geopolitical position in the Indo-Pacific. And getting all of those trade partners, including the United States, to actually finalize an agreement took about 8 years. Significant investment of time and energy, and that's not unusual. Every country involved in a trade negotiation has its own political schedule, its own priorities, and frequently trade just doesn't really make the priority during big election years or times of crisis and whatnot. So the more partners you have, then invariably the longer the negotiation is going to take. And also the TPP was a very ambitious agreement that wanted not only lower tariffs, but also lower non-tariff barriers to trade. They wanted specifically to tackle things like regulations, as well as high protections for agriculture, which historically have been normal. Even in large free trade deals like, say, the World Trade Organization, et cetera, these generally allow carve-outs for agriculture to continue to be exempt from low tariffs, because everybody wants to protect their agriculture so that they can, one, protect farmers, which is generally a politically influential group, and also so that they can be relatively self-sufficient in foodstuffs, which of course is a major strategic consideration. So getting a country to lower barriers on agriculture obviously is a priority for the U.S. as a major exporter of agricultural goods. But because that's an area that other countries are generally very, very sensitive about, it's generally not a winning issue in trade negotiations. The TPP actually was fairly successful in getting partner countries to agree to open up their markets to U.S. agriculture. But of course, then the Trump administration in its first term scuppered the agreement. The agreement actually did end up getting implemented. It was just implemented without the United States. I would point out as a side note that Japan itself was actually largely responsible for facilitating the completion of the TPP. So all of that is just to say that agriculture regulations, that's very sensitive, takes a long time to negotiate. The TPP actually did that, but ironically, Trump himself ended up abandoning it. Now we're kind of back to square one, relitigating old ground. It's possible that the Trump administration here could basically just agree to the pre-agreed concessions that were made in the previous TPP negotiation and then effectively implement the agreement finally. That's conceivable, but part of the TPP involved concessions from the United States as well in the negotiation, and it's not clear if the admin is going to be willing to make those such that they could actually de facto implement the agreement. In that sense, they may be going for something different here. So if they do just ask Japan to open up its ag market and also to loosen its automotive regulations so that US automakers are at less of a relative disadvantage, it may be that Japan pushes back significantly and either just rejects it outright or foot drags the negotiation into several months or even years. So if that happens, then this is going to be fairly unsuccessful as an effort to realign the trading relationship between Japan and the United States. If, on the other hand, the Trump administration does not go for the controversial stuff and is willing to settle for superficial concessions, this could be settled within the month. And the next meeting is going to be next month, so we'll have a much better idea where we are in these regards at that time, presumably. So that's a snapshot of negotiations with Japan specifically. I have another one here on Indonesia. So Indonesia's trade envoy, I shouldn't say it's trade envoy, its government has announced certain concessions that they're willing to make. So among these are certain categories. On food and commodities, the Indonesian government says that it's willing to increase imports of US food and commodities and also to reduce orders from countries that they currently buy these products from. That was a statement from the chief economic minister of Indonesia. And this includes things like wheat, soybeans, and soybean meal. They've also said that they're willing to increase purchases of capital goods, quote unquote. They didn't specify what capital goods. They also say that they're willing to change the regulatory apparatus so that US companies can enjoy favorable permitting and also quote unquote incentives. I'm not sure what was meant by that. This is the Indonesian government officials' wording. They said they're also willing to, quote, work on critical minerals, which is extremely ambiguous. And regarding horticulture, they said that they're willing to simplify procedures, quote unquote, related to American horticultural products. Now, that all sounds very good from a US perspective, but keep in mind, all of that is very ambiguous, in case you couldn't tell just from me describing it. It's not entirely clear what a lot of that actually means in practice. Some of it doesn't even really require change. Indonesia, let me see, I think I have the statistic here. Indonesia imports 89% of its soybeans from the US. So saying that you're going to import more soybeans doesn't really mean much when you're already importing almost 90% of your market from the United States. Like, any improvement there is going to be pretty marginal. So that's not going to move the needle too much. But it sounds good to, quote unquote, concede that you're willing to import more. So I suspect that's a superficial concession. Other areas, maybe they could import more. They import 40% of their wheat from Australia. So presumably the US could take that market share. But then that raises a big question, which is that how is the Indonesian government actually going to do that in practice? Because communists lost the Cold War, right? So we don't have centrally planned economies in the vast majority of the planet. So a government promising to import more of this or export more of that, they don't really have the authority to do that generally, because generally the major economic actors in most countries, with some exceptions, are not state directed. So if they are going to actually deliver on that promise, the only way that they can really do it is by rejiggering regulations, taxes, tariffs, things like that. But the thing is, over the past couple of decades, there's already been a lot of regulatory alignment in many ways. Tariffs have already been lowered significantly. Taxes are a major point that could be a point of concession, but that's also a very sensitive area, as you might imagine. So there's not likely to be a lot of traction there. So that doesn't leave a lot of good tools left. And even with something like regulatory concessions, that's also politically sensitive in many cases, especially when it means changing things like safety standards, environmental standards, etc. It could mean things that are uncontroversial, maybe like the official in question said, they could make it easier to get permits and things like that. But in that area, you're getting more in the realm of corruption. A lot of developing countries have very corrupt political economies. And so even if they promise to make it easier to get permits and stuff like that, that's not really going to change the underlying business environment, which is still going to be disproportionately dependent on your political connections with local or national elites. In that sense, it's very easy to maintain non-tariff barriers, even without legal barriers like permits and whatnot. The sort of invisible barriers will continue. China is very good at this. They have lots of official types of non-tariff barriers, regulations, local content requirements, for example. But even if they got rid of all of that, the Communist Party has so much power within Chinese society. It's so ubiquitous. They could very easily still influence major purchasing decisions and whatnot, even without a legal apparatus imposing a concrete set of legal barriers. So Indonesia is not as bad as China in that regard. They are nominally a democracy, but they also struggle with corruption, and personal connections are still pretty important. And so that means that when the Indonesian government promises things like making it easier to get permits, I'm a little skeptical. They would have to make much more far-reaching changes in order to make such a change actually be impactful as far as increasing American imports. So all told, these are all somewhat cagey if you actually read the fine print. So I suspect that's more evidence that this will probably end in superficial concessions, a trade agreement, quote unquote, that doesn't actually involve a lot of change by either party.
I can see how it could be interpreted as something that's good for the U.S. kind of advocating for itself, but it also seems like a shitload of paperwork and negotiation that's a lot of work for everyone.
Yeah, it can be, depending on how it's implemented. Quick note, capital goods, that's not really a concession either, because they already import a lot of capital goods from the U.S. And I don't really see firms changing who they want to buy from because their government directs them to too much, unless the government just really lands on them really hard. Most likely, firms that want to buy a particular type of capital equipment aren't going to be swayed to buy another type. They probably do have a very specific need for that type. I would point out also that the market for machine tools is monopolistic. It's not a monopoly, as in there's one seller, but generally, most machine tools are produced from a relatively small number of firms, or machine tools for a very particular niche are dominated by a single firm, one or the other. And so that means that if you do need a particular type of machine tool for a given manufacturing process, you don't generally have a lot of other options. You're probably going to need that specific machine tool. You'll have more options if you're willing to buy down market. That is to say, you're willing to buy a less sophisticated, cheaper version of the machine tool you want. But generally, the most cutting edge manufacturers are not going to do that. So a couple other things the Indonesian government has said. One, They've said specifically that they want to eliminate the trade surplus that it has with the United States. That's about $19 billion in surplus. They also say that they want to get a deal done within 60 days, which is probably pretty closely in keeping with the time frame that the Trump administration has in mind for its trade negotiations. Okay, so that's Indonesia. There were recent trade talks with an envoy from Italy that was kind of sort of talking on behalf of the European Union, but it was also representing Italy specifically. It's not entirely clear how that shakes out. Regardless, at the end of the meeting, there was a joint statement issued by both the governments of the US and Italy against, quote unquote, discriminatory taxes on digital services. Now, we've talked before about how US tech firms kind of dominate digital markets and how US regulations then that target tech firms invariably disproportionately impact American firms, and that this is a problem for Washington because, of course, they want to protect their firms and try to ensure that a minimal tax burden abroad, if possible, but more specifically, they want to fight against discrimination. And you can kind of argue that it is discriminatory for the EU to impose regulations and taxes that disproportionately impact US tech firms. Kind of a circumspect argument, given that, again, they have such large market shares. But regardless, this is why this is an issue for Washington. And so this is why it's come up here with them asking Italy to join them in this joint statement. Now, it's a victory in the sense that it does kind of divide Europe. You know, within the European Union, they try to prioritize solidarity. And so they have been trying to have a common front in trade negotiations with the US on various issues. So getting the Italian government to say that it is opposed to this is a win. However, it's one thing to say that you're opposed to it. It's another thing to actually use your veto power within the European Union to actually stop it. And I'm extremely skeptical that Italy would do that. The reason being that while the United States is a major trade partner of Italy, Italy trades much more with the rest of Europe. The European Union, by extension, invariably has much more leverage to bring to bear against Italy than the US does. And if Italy tries to run against the grain on any number of trade issues, among others, that are important to the European Union's foreign policy, it's probably going to get slammed with that leverage. So most likely, this is another superficial concession on the part of Rome. It doesn't cost them anything to say that they're against this thing, that they don't really have that much power to change. Mm-hmm. Italy, for its part, actually has a 3% levy on revenue from internet transactions for digital companies with sales of at least 750 million euros. So they themselves have actually already done this on an individual basis, you know, on it, what's the word I want? Unilaterally. They have unilaterally done this without the rest of Europe kind of participating. I don't think that they have agreed to waive that levy. I think they're going to continue with that. And I don't think Washington is going to do much about it. Because again, Washington sees potential in trying to divide Europe and make it less likely that they have a common front as far as taxing US tech companies by trying to exploit relationships with individual governments like the Italian government, which technically has a right-wing, if not far-right, depending on who you talk to, government. I think the Trump administration sees them as a natural ally, and they're going to try to play that up. I don't think they're going to be successful, but I think that is the strategy that they're going to pursue. Now, the Italian government itself actually has good incentive not to do this for reasons that are political, for reasons that have to do with domestic politics in Italy. Meloni, that is to say, the prime minister of Italy's own party, actually wants to tax tech firms more, partly just because Italy's finances are not that good and they need the revenue, but also because the party wants to spend on certain priorities. And they want to use the revenue from taxing tech companies to do it. So while it might sound nice to, you know, aver and defer to U.S. preferences on this in order to get some kind of trade concessions that maybe are not offered to the rest of Europe, the invariable punishment you would get from the rest of Europe would kind of deflate that, probably exceed it. But also, domestically, there would be a penalty. Meloni's own, again, the prime minister of Italy's own voters would probably punish her for doing this because they don't really see much benefit to not taxing foreign tech entities that they don't really like. You know, everybody kind of hates tech firms right now. They have a lot of power in U.S. politics because they're all based here, but The trade-off there is that by not having a strong presence in many other countries, they're less able to leverage their size and heft and profits to influence public policy that influences them, that impacts them.
Makes sense.
Okay, so beyond negotiations, as far as tariff updates, I think on Monday, Trump said that he was considering a modification to the 25% tariffs that were imposed on foreign auto and auto parts imports from Mexico, Canada, as well, actually just everybody else. They were general 25% tariffs on imports of cars and car parts. Although I again point out that the tariffs on car parts are not actually going to be implemented until later. I think at the beginning of the next month, in May. He did not specify what the modifications would be, much to my frustration. Markets were delighted. They were quite happy to speculate that this would be very helpful to automakers, which have really been struggling in the stock market. But details are very, very scarce, so I don't even know if he's going to actually follow up on this. The specific statement mentioned that because tariffs would raise the cost of cars by thousands of dollars, car companies needed a little bit of time. And this is a quote here, a direct quote. Car companies need a little bit of time because they're going to make them here, end quote. So again, he's framing this delay as not an abandonment of this policy, but basically just allowing companies more time to adapt, which is good. That makes much more sense than what he was doing before. But again, there's this credibility issue where we still don't know if he's actually going to follow through with this. We still don't know exactly what the objectives of the tariffs are. There's relatively more clarity on that. I'll get to that a little later. But there's still a lot of ambiguity, too much so for this really to lead to substantive changes to the trading relationship beyond just slowing down trade with everybody, because everybody is hedging their bets right now. There was a local win for Trump here. Nissan said on Friday, I think this would have been last Friday technically, that it will maintain 2 shifts of production at a plant in Smyrna, Tennessee. And this happened after announcing in January they would actually eliminate 1 shift. So the tariffs presumably have something to do with that. I would be surprised if it was otherwise. So the Trump administration, of course, cited that as an example that the administration's policies are working. It's very easy, I would point out, to shift production to a pre-existing plant that has excess capacity. But I would also point out that there's not enough existing excess capacity in the United States to absorb all of the tariff, all of the shift in demand that would occur if all imports were cut off. Doing so would invariably mean massive shortages and inflation. So this is a win, but this is also the low-hanging fruit as far as reshoring goes. The real test is going to be FDI, not just FDI, but just investment in general. And that has yet to materialize. And I think everybody is pretty skeptical at this point that it will, unless the administration significantly changes tack. The administration did say that it's going to honor a 1979 aircraft parts agreement. This is mostly relevant to Canada, which has a significant market share in a lot of aeronautics parts. So there had been some question as to just how this trade agreement would interact with all of the new tariffs. The Trump administration has clarified that it will continue to honor the agreement. However, it would violate the agreement by imposing 10% tariffs. Again, the 10% is just baseline on everybody, pretty much. There are some exemptions here and there, but it seems that aeronautical parts are not going to be among them. So they're going to get hit with 10% tariffs in spite of the agreement. However, higher tariffs that may come into play are not going to affect it. And it's not just Canada that's part of the agreement. So that is relevant for producers in, say, Europe or Japan that may produce some of these parts. Let's see. Oh, I accidentally put some Ukraine notes in my trade notes. Okay, there's been some... Go ahead.
Sorry, as a note, I'm between games. I don't know when you want to do the map.
Oh, we can just do it now. It won't take long. It's very simple.
Okay. I have two. There's a 90-day pause and a April 2.
April 2 would be first.
Okay.
So this is just a map of the tariffs as they were announced on April 2nd, but before they were delayed. So this is basically, this is based off of the big chart that the administration released. So I wrote down all of the individual tariffs for every country, and then I created this map. So the green countries are just the ones that have 10% tariffs, according to the chart. Yellow is 10 to, I think, 20%? No, 10 to 30%. So countries that have tariffs, according to the original chart released on April 2nd, that are between 10 and 30% are colored yellow, and then everything higher than 30% is red. So as you can see, China and Southeast Asia were hit pretty hard. And then also Southern Africa, not Sub-Saharan Africa broadly, just specifically Southern Africa, pretty much Angola on down.
Madagascar is, do they have vanilla or chocolate or something?
Correct.
Yeah. So Mexico and Canada don't have a color. Russia doesn't have a color.
Yeah, Russia, Belarus have sanctions, so they didn't qualify, apparently. Cuba as well didn't qualify because of sanctions. Burkina Faso apparently doesn't exist. Mauritania actually should be green. That was an update. The initial chart didn't have Mauritania on it. I think a later updated version did. But then for Canada and Mexico, they actually kind of do have the 10% tariffs. But I think that the Trump administration made the exemption that goods that are eligible under the rules of origin rules under the CUSMA agreement are not subject to the 10% baseline.
In South America, is that Colombia that's red? Or Venezuela? Guyana. What did they do?
Energy exporter. It's a very tiny country. I don't think the population exceeds 1 million people.
Oh, okay.
But they found oil, I think, maybe 10 years ago. And so now they produce a little bit. So they produce a fairly valuable commodity, which means their exports are relatively high. But because it's a tiny, tiny market of like 700,000 people, they don't import hardly anything. So that means they invariably have a trade surplus with the United States. And because the reciprocal tariffs were calculated based off of trade deficits, Guyana got hit relatively hard. Basically the same story with Venezuela.
Poor Falkland Islands.
Or the Falkland Islands as well. They export a lot more than they can even conceivably import because of the disparity between the high value commodity they export and the relative size of their market. Southern Africa, basically, that's why they're impacted so much here. Because they export a lot of raw materials of one kind or another, but are relatively economically undeveloped, they don't have a lot of purchasing power. So their exports invariably exceed their imports. And so because of that trade deficit, then they got hit hard with the reciprocal tariffs. China and Southeast Asia, that's just because of Chinese industrial policy, Chinese trade advantages, etc. So no surprise that that whole region kind of got hit. Southeast Asia re-exports a lot of Chinese goods, so they've actually seen their trade surpluses with the U.S. balloon over time. So that's why they're red as well as China. It's basically all just one Chinese market effectively, and it all got hit pretty hard.
Gotcha. So that was kind of like an AoE hitting
pretty
the
much.
Chinese market, and those markets are linked to the Chinese market, so punish them too, I guess, is the thought? Or just they export a lot of stuff.
Just trade surplus. It was just the raw calculation was just about trade deficits. So the fact that they were hit hard just reflects the fact that there was so many Chinese goods that were being re-exported through the region. or even just produced in the region for export onto the United States.
Cool. And there was one other.
Yeah, so the other one is just an updated version that reflects what the tariff regime actually looks like right now, given the 90-day delay that was announced. And it's exactly what it looks like. Because of the 90-day delay, none of the tariffs in excess of 10% were actually implemented except for China. So everybody got 10% except China.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So it looks like being lenient on the world, but now looks like it includes more countries total, but maybe not.
Should be the same.
Yeah. So we've had a 10% tariff baseline with these countries before, or this is the new plan that's being gone for?
Sorry, what?
Is this map we're looking at with just the 10% and then the higher tariff on China? Is this what's going to stay in effect, or at 90 days, are they going to try to put all of them in?
Oh, nobody knows what's going to happen in 90 days. That's anybody's guess. Okay. This is just what we have right now.
Gotcha. This seems like a kerfuffle to me.
It is very much that.
Huh. Well, thank you for making those maps. Were there any other countries that were like, I don't know, surprising? I know we covered a lot of them individually last week. So if you missed that, this is part 2 of a 2-episode series on the tariffs. That's also why Chap pointed out he is talking relatively more, as he has a lot of notes on this topic to get through. We've done this before with big picture stuff like World War II. But yeah, this is a big kerfuffle. There's a lot of, it's a hullabaloo. We'll see what actually goes through. I'm curious to see what happens.
That everybody is. Join the club. Very wealthy individuals who trade for a living, who make a living on the stock market, major and institutional investors, they're in exactly the same boat. Nobody knows exactly where this is going.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody's on the same ride, and at least in that regard.
Yeah. Just wanted to have a quick moment for all the people who are going to have to do a bunch of weird paperwork negotiations because of this. I can see how one could interpret the situation as applying pressure and gaining concessions as a good thing. Like, you should fight for the deals you have with the countries that are established. But it's a lot of stuff all at once because you're applying them to the world rather than to like, okay, these are our countries that we want to target for some tariffs. It's just like, yeet everyone.
Yeah, I suspect the Trump administration kind of is of two minds on this. Trump himself seems to like being belligerent. He's a big fan of madman theory, which doesn't really work that well in many contexts, including this one. But he seems to think that if he can credibly threaten other countries by making them think that he seriously doesn't give a shit about the consequences of these kinds of dramatic policy proposals and changes, then that increases his leverage and he can get more out of them. Mm-hmm. So there's that aspect of the Trump administration where they try to go big and scare people into giving concessions. But Trump himself doesn't actually run the nuts and bolts of his presidency. Pretty much no president does that. He outsources a lot to his advisors, and his advisors are relatively more competent, even when they're a little bit eccentric, like some of them have been over the course of his presidencies. They tend to be more focused, and they tend to prefer a more traditional approach to public policy making. Mm-hmm. So what happens then is, because Trump is a domineering individual and wants to do things his way, they kind of go with the flow as far as big dramatic announcements, and then they'll try to rationalize those announcements, but then they'll also try to do their own thing in parallel. And generally it's what his I don't want to say underlings, that's not quite right. Generally what the other people that he delegates to in his administration do, those efforts generally define policy going forward. And then the stuff Trump does is kind of more on the side. It doesn't end up being necessarily all that impactful. That's been the pattern over time that I noticed, especially in his first term. He made a bunch of dramatic pronouncements on trade, started a trade war with China, and then he just kind of left the actual negotiating to some of his trade people. And those people were actually pretty good, relatively speaking, at trying to negotiate deals and whatnot. In so much as they failed, it was more due to just intrinsic difficulties of doing so. Just inherently, it's difficult to get past the various interests of different countries, trying to jibe them, kind of get them all on the same page, trying to, give them concessions such that they're willing to trade away make themselves vulnerable, basically. So that's intrinsically, trade negotiations are difficult. That's more why they failed. But the Trump himself didn't really help. A lot of the theatrics that he sort of indulges in don't really do anything other than impose costs on people without a corresponding benefit. That's always been one of my big criticisms of him. I do have criticisms for some of the people that actually are responsible for trade and actually do the negotiations in his administration, both this one and the last one. I don't think that, well, we'll get to that. But basically, yeah, there's kind of there's two wolves in the Trump administration. There's kind of two approaches to negotiating. One of them is more serious. That's the one I try to focus more on. The Trumpian shenanigans, that's kind of a different track. And generally, I'm inclined to assume that's not going to go anywhere. That I could be wrong. Hopefully I'm wrong, but we'll see. But certainly, in so much as I'm critical of that side, it's more because of the costs. That's the main reason I'm critical of that side. But I'm also critical of the other side for reasons I'm going to get into in a minute. So just to finish the update here, Trump threatened pharmaceutical tariffs. I kind of talked a little bit about this last time, but there's not really a lot new to report, but he has kind of doubled down on it. So this does seem to be something that's coming. That's going to be fairly disruptive if he actually does it. I don't know that he actually will. His pattern thus far has been to threaten, but as far as actually delivering blows, they've been relatively mild, so we'll see. But if he does impose pharmaceutical tariffs, that's definitely going to have a disproportionate impact on people who are sick, people who are elderly, people with chronic conditions, etc. Let's see. Oh, also he announced that he actually is going... We talked about the exemption to electronics last time. That was like breaking news when we talked last time. But then after he clarified that, while electronics, including semiconductors, are going to be exempt, that exemption is not going to last. He says that he is planning to tariff semiconductors specifically. He clarified here that the tariffs on semiconductors are going to be a kind of replacement for the tariffs on electronics. The idea is that he wants to, again, incentivize production here, etc. But this also does represent a kind of return to the tariffs on electronics. It's very confusing. I don't entirely know how he wants to operationalize this. He says that he wants to tariff semiconductors to incentivize production here, and he says that he wants to use that to replace the tariffs on electronic goods. So it could be that this is basically a fancy way of saying the exemption will stay. The exemption for electronics is going to stay, and they actually will kind of forego tariffing them in future. But it could also mean that they're going to design the tariffs on semiconductors in such a way that effectively they will be still tariffing electronics. Could go either way. I don't know how to interpret that. But basically, if you were counting on cheaper electronics because of the exemption and the delays on tariffs that have been announced thus far, don't relax yet, because this is going to be revisited. Oh, another negotiation. The United Kingdom is negotiating with the US over all of this. The Prime Minister of the UK said that he was suspending tariffs on 89 products. And that was apparently like a preliminary concession to the United States to show its willingness to negotiate. The Trump administration has not rewarded efforts like this in the past, so I really don't think this is a good move on their part. They really should have held out. But regardless, this is London's approach thus far. They've given some early concessions here. Some of the sticking points in negotiations with the UK are going to be car and steel tariffs, which the United States has already implemented. These are going to disproportionately impact UK steel, which is already really hurting right now. The British steel industry has actually been in the news in the past couple weeks. It's kind of going bankrupt. I think the British government announced that they were considering nationalizing it. I don't remember if they actually did decide to go through with it, but they're very seriously looking at that as a possibility in order to save the industry. British digital regulations, like I mentioned before, foreign digital regulations of U.S. tech firms is something that grates Washington. Specifically, the Online Safety Act in the UK is something that Washington wants to water down or even get rid of. So that's going to come up in the negotiations. Also, the government is resistant to importing U.S. chlorinated chicken. This is something that previous U.S. administrations have pushed on Europe and the UK in particular. They actually have restrictions on the importation and sale of chicken that has been chlorinated. Chlorination is just a process by which they basically clean the chicken. The Europeans say that it introduces risks of, I think, cancer, diseases, something like that. I don't remember the specifics. But they've regulated it out of the market. The U.S., at behest of U.S. agricultural producers, wants to open up the market by allowing chlorinated chicken in. And so they've been insisting on that. So that's almost certainly going to come up here in negotiations between the U.S. and the U.K. Okay, so some more substantive stuff on the tariffs and what's been going on there. There's actually been a power game playing out within the Trump administration as far as influencing the administration's trade policy. And, to kind of start with the conclusion here, the winner of that battle has been the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Besant, or Besant, I don't know how to pronounce it. He apparently has been trying to outmaneuver some of the trade hawks in the administration, especially Peter Navarro, and he has apparently successfully done so. One of the examples of that was April 9th, when the reciprocal tariffs were supposed to go into effect. Bond markets kind of scared everybody by spiking, and so apparently Besant was able to successfully, partly by using that specific event, convince the Trump administration, convince Donald Trump himself to delay by 90 days the tariffs. Not entirely clear if maybe they weren't already planning that, but from what I was reading, Besant played a key role in pushing that forward. Apparently, he's also been trying to push Trump to be more clear as to what the objectives of the trade policy are supposed to be in order to boost confidence in the administration's policy, its intentions, and also to stabilize markets. I would remind everybody that the Secretary of the Treasury, Mr. Besant, whatever his name is, has a background in finance, and so he kind of knows that stabilizing the market is important, and that's a priority for him. Now, one of the ways that he's successfully beaten the competition on this is something that was done by people competing for Trump's attention in his first term, which is to meet with him personally and to try to do so without the presence of your rival, because Trump tends to listen to the last person he talked to. And so what he did is that he timed a meeting with Trump very quickly based off of a meeting that Peter Navarro had with somebody else. So while Peter Navarro was in that meeting, Besant called basically an emergency meeting with Trump along with some of his aides, and they were able apparently to successfully convince him that there should be stronger messaging, giving greater clarity to markets about what the trade policy was designed to do. So Navarro, being a hawk, generally prefers the more Trumpian approach to kind of kick up dirt, make things ambiguous, because he thinks that gives the administration more leverage. Besant obviously disagrees with that and thinks that it's better to be more clear, so that the policy so that people will have more confidence in the policy such that it has its intended effect. So in my reading anyway, authors and contacts in the administration have said that Besant now seems to be the point guy for trade within the administration. He's taken on a more prominent role as far as like publicly announcing the trade policy and its goals. Navarro has kind of played an increasingly small role over the past couple weeks. Now, this is something that's happened in just the past few weeks, so this isn't necessarily something that's going to last. Obviously, they're going to keep fighting with each other, jockeying for position within the administration. But for now, at least, the traditionalists seem to be gaining ground here. And so there's been correspondingly more normal sounding announcements about trade policy out of Washington in the past week in particular. And so I'm going to talk about that specifically next. So Scott Bessent released a statement saying that the U.S. planned to use tariff negotiations to isolate China. He said that he wants, specifically U.S. officials want to use talks with more than 70 countries to ask them to do the following: to disallow China to ship goods through them, in other words, to curb the re-export market, to prevent Chinese firms from locating in them to avoid U.S. tariffs. That's basically just another way of re-exporting. To not absorb China's cheap industrial goods into their economies. I assume that's because the U.S. wants to try to preserve market share for its own producers, but that's kind of a weird ask because Chinese producers already have a very large market share in those places. If he means anti-dumping, then he doesn't really need to make that an issue. Countries in Southeast Asia are already taking using anti-dumping duties against Chinese producers and have been for some time. So the third point is a little strange to me. First 2 points, though, make a lot of sense. Obviously, the United States wants to coordinate different countries in order to try to offset Chinese leverage from their manufacturing sector, because they are such a large manufacturer, large exporter, and a large importer, mind you, also of raw resources, that they have a lot of economic leverage over countries. And the only way to kind of deflect that is to do so on a multilateral basis. China prefers, for that very reason, bilateral negotiations, because those maximize their economic leverage over other countries. So Bessent here seems to be pushing a more traditional China hawk's perspective on trade negotiations. If this is the intended purpose, and perhaps was from the start, then that means the United States never really intended to disrupt trade with other countries. It more just wanted to scare them into adhering to the U.S. line on China and getting them to cooperate on China initiatives originating in the United States designed to curb Chinese exports and also to mitigate Chinese economic influence in other countries. That's logical. That's not unreasonable. The Biden administration basically wanted to do the same thing. Previous administrations, even before Trump, also wanted to do that. They just hadn't been very proactive about it. Trump obviously has been extremely proactive about this. But the trouble here, the criticism, is that he's a little too proactive. You know, you're kind of scaring your trading partners a little too much into trying to toe the China line, to the point where they actually kind of would prefer either just to be neutral and non-aligned, in so much as that's even possible, or even maybe just to side with China. And I don't think that's what Washington intends for this to do. Now, it could be that Bessent is a moderating influence, and that these policy announcements get more moderate over time and less bombastic, less Trumpian. If that's so, that's all for the better. That's much more reasonable, and I think more likely to result in countries actually wanting to cooperate with the United States on the China issue. But for now, that doesn't seem to be happening. But we are at least trending in the right direction. And Bessent, for his part, gets full credit here for trying to at least pretend to offer more clarity. And I have to say pretend, because we still don't know if this is actually their objective. This could just be Bessent trying to provide a rationale for Trump's erratic policy here, which still kind of lacks direction and a sense of purpose. I think it's good that he tried to offer this, even if it's a lie, because, again, markets really needed some clarity. And I hope he can kind of continues in that vein. But I still can't say confidently that this is the reason for the trade conflict as we see it right now. We're going to need more time to figure that out.
Well, it seems like the idea of assessing one's trade relations, that's valid. It seems like too much AOE, to use the gamer term. We hit too many countries at once with this for it to really seem like a cohesive move. It's like, for one, a lot of work, and then for two, we're affecting a lot of our allies negatively, and it's sort of like some of our enemies are being punished less than our allies, which is a really confusing stance to be taking, because you're going to affect their economy negatively. And maybe you want to punish them for something, but it seems like there were certain countries that were getting punished that, at least from my biased perspective, I feel like we should not be punishing them. And then, to your point, is it even going to turn into anything? it sort of reminded me of the TikTok ban. Like, is it just another kayfabe power move of like, I'm going to take this away to show you that I can take this away, but you can actually still have this? I just want you to know that I control this. Like, I don't get it.
Personally, that's my preferred theory.
Okay.
I think that's the most likely, but that's just me speculating. I can't say for sure. It may be that they actually do have some kind of particular end state in mind for these negotiations, and that they're just sort of kind of haphazardly, chaotically working towards it. But I think that's, given the Trump administration's behavior in its current incarnation and in the first term, I think that's a pretty charitable reading. I'm pretty dubious about that. But I would concede that it's possible, and that it's too early to conclude solidly that that's not the case. So we shall see.
Yeah, Chad, if you have any zany and fun theories for what the plan is, feel free to leave us a YouTube comment. We love those, even if you don't like our stance on stuff. It's good to be sobered and balanced by other people's opinions, even if you don't necessarily agree with them after you hear them. It's like, that's cool. I'm glad I know more human perspectives. So thanks, chat and comments, for participating in World Discussion.
I will say that one of the clear preferences of Donald Trump and his administrations over time has been speed. He prefers to do things quickly and dramatically. And that's very much at odds with the traditional public policy approach of pretty much every preceding administration, as well as of politicians in the United States in general, as well as in contrast with American political culture in general, which is more belligerent than most Western countries, but does have a deliberative side to it. Trump doesn't really seem to like that very much. He seems to see that as too slow, too ineffective. And in turn, he tends to prefer these more dramatic pronouncements that are kind of high risk, high reward. You know, the idea being that if you go big, maybe it doesn't lead anywhere, but you at least take a chance of getting something in a very short term.
Using the anchoring bias to your advantage, where you give everyone a really aggressively bad deal, and then you tune that back to a slight change. It looks like you were merciful.
Yeah, that's probably a good way of putting it. If you want to contrast, you can look at the Biden administration. They announced early in their administration in 2021 that they were going to do a full review of America's trading relationship with China, and that they were going to design up a strategy to deal with China. And that review took something like a year and a half. You know, that's how long it took for all of their officials to go through all of the data, talk to people, negotiate, do interagency consultations, and then eventually come to a common set of ideas, plans, strategies, etc. And the end result of that was not entirely satisfactory either. Basically, it was the, how does it go? The small yard, tall fence, I believe is what it was called. So that's not a bad strategy. I mean, that's at least viable. It's coherent. But it also left unaddressed certain key areas, and it had some, critical weaknesses as far as certain other strategic areas of the relationship that maybe could not be affected by export controls. It very narrowly focused on critical technologies at the expense of just general market access to China and various other forms of Chinese trade malfeasance. So, that's a legitimate criticism. I get that. But I'm highlighting here the process. It took them a year and a half to go through and actually strategize. Then they came up with a plan, and then they implemented it slowly but thoroughly. And a big part of that plan was being very, very targeted. I would say that was probably the defining characteristic of the Biden administration's approach to dealing not only with China, but also diplomatically engaging with other countries regarding China. They were very, very targeted. They didn't want to hit other countries with collateral damage. They wanted to make sure that they tried to give other countries as much reason as possible to cooperate with the United States. And they did not always do that without sticks. There always was kind of the implicit threat that they could go harder if they wanted to. But they generally didn't play that up. They generally tried to focus on common interests and to try to push that as the leading reason to cooperate and to try to have that be the basis of an anti-China coalition. The process in the Trump administration is just the complete opposite. His approach is that they don't need to talk to allies or to China. They can just hurt everybody and then tell everybody, work with me against China or I'm going to hurt you more. And the Trump administration's basic logic there is that the US has enough leverage as the leading superpower that it can do that without significant negative consequence to itself. That this effort will be successful even if it's very disruptive in the short term. That's kind of the crux of the strategy. And again, we don't really know what exactly the end point is supposed to be, but on China at least, that seems to be a consistent feature across both terms of the Trump administration. And I don't think it's going to work, because that is very short term, and states are very much long-term actors. They can afford to strategize. So when they see an actor like Trump, who's very disruptive but also very inexperienced, their general attitude is that they could wait them out. And over the course of the past 10 years, countries that have done that have generally been rewarded for their patience. We'll see if that happens again this time. Trump is going much harder this time. But in turn, he's also generating significant amounts of political resistance and trading partners. That's going to make it easier for those trading partners to kind of weather the storm here and wait them out. We are, in a sense, in a kind of political trade siege warfare right now. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that is kind of the gist of it, at least as far as the Trump administration, at least in the way that the Trump administration is approaching this. And they're going to be more successful in some cases than others, but I think as far as overarching objectives, at least those we know of, like reshoring or containing China, or rebalancing trade with the rest of the world, whatever the fuck that's supposed to mean, I don't think any of that is really achievable here with this approach. I'm not saying don't do that stuff at all. A lot of that stuff does have to happen. You know, I'm not going to blame him for prioritizing those objectives. I just don't see a lot of competence as far as actually trying to obtain them, to the point that I'm extremely skeptical that he's even really that serious about obtaining them. That's, again, is why I think it's mostly just kayfabe. I don't think he takes a lot of this very seriously, and by extension, I don't either.
But people
Doesn't
have
mean
to
people won't
do a lot of
do it.
stuff. They have to do a lot of stuff as a result of it, though.
Yeah.
So it costs a lot of resources to posture in such a way, and meetings and time and all that. But if your objective is attention, then the outcome doesn't matter as long as you're a part of it.
Yeah. They're winning very hard in that regard. Let's see, almost done with the update. There was clarity on the electronics exemption. A little more anyway. The White House clarified that critical electronics made in China would revert to the 20% tariff announced in March. And they cited as a reason for this the country's role as a major source of chemical precursors for fentanyl, basically. So this is then kind of carving out an exemption to the exemption. They had exempted electronics goods, which mostly impacted China. But here they're saying it's going to go back to 20%, but they're saying it's going to go back to 20% because of fentanyl. So again, very confusing on where the exemptions lie with electronics. I still don't know just what the tariff will be in the medium run, or even necessarily in the short run. Very mixed messaging there from the administration. I already mentioned earlier, some confusion about the messaging, so this is just more mixed signals to me. I don't entirely know what to make of it. Okay, some new trading barriers the administration threw up regard shipping fees. So, when ships dock in your country's ports, they generally have to pay some kind of fee. That's not unusual. The Trump administration wants to hike fees for certain ships. And basically, the target will not surprise you. It's China, specifically. Chinese-built ships kind of, I don't want to say dominate, but they have a very large market share in the market for cargo ships. And the Trump administration has said that one of its priorities is building up the U.S. shipbuilding industry because our shipbuilding capacity is so low. I think the statistic I have in that regard is that U.S. shipbuilders turn out about 5 ships annually. In that same time frame, annually, China produces about 1,700 ships. So there's a big disparity in terms of shipbuilding capacity that has people concerned about the strategic ramifications. If there were some kind of big war, the Chinese would enjoy a much greater ability to replace losses than the United States would because of their greater shipbuilding capacity. I don't think that's entirely relevant, just as a side note, because I don't think wars in the future are necessarily going to center too much around naval vessels. As we've seen in Ukraine, it's probably going to center much more around drones of one kind or another. Maritime drones, aerial drones, etc. Stuff like that is probably going to end up being more important. Ships still play an important role as platforms for weapons like that, like drones, but also for ranged fires of one kind or another. But I don't think if the United States took a lot of hits in a conflict, in a naval conflict with China, as far as losing ships, that we would not be able to find alternative ways to hit back and propagate the conflict. I suspect there would be immediate and rapid innovation in that regard, not unlike what was seen in World War II. For those not familiar with the analogy I'm trying to make there, the U.S. Navy was still very much a battleship navy in the 1930s. Most navies were. But then most of the U.S.'s battleships were sunk in the attack on Pearl Harbor. Well, maybe not most, but a disproportionate chunk. Certainly most of the Pacific Fleet lost their main frontline ships. And so the result is that they had to rapidly pivot to aircraft carriers, which were the main alternative. And, you know, there was a lot of talk about having fleets focused on aircraft carriers before that, but generally the battleship proponents won out. And so while they still invested in aircraft carriers, they were not supposed to be the heart of a fleet. And what happened is that over the course of the Pacific War with Japan, they very rapidly became the heart of the fleet anyway, by necessity. So part of that was just improvising a fleet after the losses of the Pearl Harbor attack. Part of it was just natural evolution, since warfare was kind of heading that way anyway. But regardless, the catalyst was Pearl Harbor. That was like the immediate change that spurred that. So I suspect something similar might happen with a naval battle with China. You know, even if the U.S. Navy takes heavy losses, I suspect that they would shift gears and put emphasis on alternative modes of warfare beyond just ship to ship, which I think is what a lot of laymen think of when they think of a naval war with China. So, tangents aside, the U.S. government wants to shore up shipbuilding capacity in the United States. One of the ways they want to do that is by basically increasing shipping fees on either ships that are made in China or Chinese shipping companies. Both of those will be subject to higher fees going forward. And the idea is to try to incentivize shipping companies to use other ships, preferably US-made ships, but I would note in the design of the policy, as stated thus far, that they actually don't incentivize shipping companies to buy US-made ships. They're just disincentivizing them from buying Chinese ships. And the criticism I've heard thus far is that this is going to result not in more orders for US-made ships, but rather trade diversion to Japanese and Korean shipbuilders. And that could still be a net positive in so much as it undermines Chinese shipbuilding capacity, but it's not really going to build up U.S. shipbuilding capacity that much. At least that's if the policy is implemented as it's been announced thus far. So to give you some specifics, it's going to be for Chinese-built ships or ships owned by Chinese companies. They will be charged the higher of either $50 a net ton or $120 for each container. And these fees are actually going to increase slowly over the course of 3 years. The $50 a net ton is going to increase by $30 a year over the next 3 years. And the $120 for each container is going to increase ultimately to $250 per container at the end of the 3 years in question. Chinese-built ships owned by non-Chinese firms will be charged $18 a net ton, with annual fee increases of $5 over the same period. Let's see, and then fees will be applied. Okay, there's a limitation to this. Fees will be applied once each voyage, because ships, when they cross the ocean, you know, they'll visit multiple ports in the United States, not just one. So they will not be billed for each port that they visit, they'll just be billed for the first port that they visit. And then the fee will only apply a maximum of 6 times a year. So if a ship is visiting the US more than 6 times a year, after the 6th visit, they will not have to pay the fee. So I would point out that this is a relatively smartly designed policy overall. They're not immediately hitting the shippers with very high fees. They're rolling out the high fees over the course of 3 years. And then they're putting limitations on how often the fees can be imposed. I've read that I don't want to say exemptions, the limitations that were imposed, the 1 fee per voyage and the limitation to 6 fees a year, that was apparently the result of lobbying by shipping firms. So you can't give the administration too much credit in that regard, but I do give them credit for rolling it out over 3 years. I don't know that that was the result of shippers lobbying. Regardless, even the fact that they consulted the industry that was going to be most affected, that is pretty smart. So of the trade policies the Trump administration has rolled out since his inauguration, this is probably one of the best designed ones. It's still not going to serve its intended purpose of helping U.S. shipbuilders that much, but that could change. They could modify it in future, and it may be that it wasn't really intended to shore up U.S. shipbuilders in the first place. This could just be part and parcel of the administration's overall trade pressure on China, and in that sense, this could just be additional leverage that could be used in the negotiation. There are exemptions. One, ships that visit the United States that pick up American goods for exports, they will not have to pay the fee. Ships that ferry goods between domestic ports in the United States will not have to pay the fee. This includes those from ports to Caribbean islands and U.S. territories. So that's intuitive for me, but maybe deserves elaboration. Basically, if you're affected by the Jones Act, you're exempt. So if you're moving from Puerto Rico to a mainland U.S. port, you're exempt, for example. American and Canadian vessels that call at Great Lakes ports, basically there's a lot of ships that work the Great Lakes trade network. Some of them are Chinese made. They're just all going to be exempt from this. Empty ships that arrive at U.S. ports to load up with exports, that's specifically the exemption that they get. I should clarify that. So not just anybody who comes to the United States to pick up goods for export. Specifically, the ship has to be empty when it arrives in the United States, and then pick up exports, and then leave. They get the exemption. There's also going to be a refund. Apparently, foreign carriers will be eligible for a refund of fees if they order or take delivery of a U.S.-built vessel of equivalent capacity within the next 3 years. Now, that does incentivize U.S. shipbuilding somewhat, but that's also a pretty weak incentive. You can still just buy them cheaper from Korea or Japan. And I don't think the refund on fees is going to be even remotely enough to cover the cost difference between Japanese or Korean producers and American producers. But it is a nice touch. I give them credit for that. Let's see. There's also a mandate involved here. Liquefied natural gas carriers will be required to move 1% of U.S. LNG exports on U.S.-built, operated, and flagged vessels within 4 years. And that percentage would rise to 4% by 2035 and 15% by 2047. I'm not a big fan of mandate policies in general, because they generally don't go into effect so far in the future that it's almost inevitable that they'll either get an extension, be delayed, or just get scrapped by different administrations that come in or because of changing economic circumstances. So I'm a little dubious about this, but it does incentivize purchase of U.S. ships. I think this is a better approach than the other approaches that are a part of this policy. But it's also kind of narrow. LNG carriers, ships that are designed to handle liquefied natural gas are specialized. That's not like a cargo ship, which is kind of more generic. You can kind of use it for different things. LNG carriers, you can pretty much only use that for one thing. So the market for LNG carriers is relatively narrow. So I think that's a more viable prospect as far as potential increases in shipbuilding capacity in the United States. But I think even if this is successful in increasing relevant production, it's still not going to amount to very much overall, just because that part of the market is relatively small. Let's see, context. Yeah, I already did that. So yeah, that's the shipping fee policy that's been implemented. And again, I suspect this is not so much geared at helping out U.S. shipyards. I think this is probably more about pressuring China, but I could also be wrong. I would point out that the main way that the government over the past 10 years has tried to shore up the U.S. shipbuilding industry has been to try to coordinate with allies like Japan and South Korea to try to integrate their defense industrial bases more with the United States, such that the United States can order more ships from them legally, because right now there's laws in place that pretty much require the U.S. Navy to buy mostly from U.S. producers. So if they could tap Korean and Japanese producers, that would significantly increase the capacity that would be available to the U.S. military, and could also expedite the production of U.S. ships that have been on order for some time. Now, that approach doesn't result in U.S. shipbuilding capacity increasing so much. I imagine part of a defense industrial base integration would be partner countries ordering more from U.S. shipbuilders to kind of help them out. That's a quid pro quo that I suspect would be fairly acceptable to every party, but it's also not something that's actually happened yet, because this is a very slow process. As we've discussed before, countries are very sensitive about their defense industrial base, and they don't really like sharing very much. So getting countries to make concessions on that requires a lot of comfort. I don't want to call it pillow talk, but basically you have to give them lots of assurances. Lots of guarantees.
You're such a great country. We love you guys.
I mean, the diplomatic equivalent of that, pretty much. So it's going to be a slow process that plays out over time, like pretty much any given foreign policy. But it also has more merit to it. It's more likely to succeed and actually eventually deliver something tangible. Policies like this one help at the margin, but generally are not enough to significantly move the needle in the desired fashion. Let's see. Also, the USTR announced that it would discuss, this is actually from May 19th. The USTR, this is the United States Trade Representative, will discuss proposed tariffs on ship-to-shore cranes, chassis that carry containers, and chassis parts. And the background here is that China just dominates the production of all of that. So almost all of the cranes that you see at U.S. ports are made in China. And the U.S. government would prefer to import more of them either from allies or to make them in the United States. And so they're actually considering a tariff of 100% on the import of these things. I don't know if that's specifically for importation of these items from China or from other countries. But regardless, 100% is very high. So that suggests they want to go hard on this. Although given how high tariffs on China already are, that it may not end up meaning much. Okay, that's the update. Took an hour and a half.
Nice, thank you.
So, now we can get back to where we were last time. Reciprocal tariffs, part 2.
Oh, we didn't even start there yet.
We haven't started that yet.
Oh, okay. Chad, you thought we were talking tariffs. We didn't even start talking about tariffs.
Yeah, what we've discussed thus far is the newer developments. Now we get back to just describing tariffs in general, specifically the reciprocal tariffs in general. So again, last time we talked details, like what exactly was being tariffed, who was being tariffed, what the tariffs were set at, etc. And a little bit about their impacts, primary and secondary impacts. So today we're going to talk winners and losers. And then I think also... yeah, secondary effects. We did primary effects last time, I think.
We do have questions too. I don't know how much budget time you have.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I'm going to try to power through this so that we can finish it today, so that we don't have a part 3.
Okay.
Because there is other stuff going on in the world. I'm sure people would like to hear about it at some point. In my defense, I would point out that this is like the main thing happening in world affairs right now. So it's not entirely unjustified for me to spend 2 episodes talking about this.
Valid. You may proceed.
Winners and losers by industry. Okay, so some winners. U.S. chip makers are winners. They got an exemption on semiconductors, copper, a major input, as well as rare earth materials, another major input. The U.S. actually does still have some producers of chips, and they're the ones that are going to, bear most of the benefit here. Dell, there's some Samsung operations that are cropping up in the United States. All of them benefit from the aforementioned exemptions. So the U.S. chipmaker industry, definitely a big winner here. The energy industry, also a winner. Energy imports were exempted. So that means that it's more so energy refiners that are going to benefit, not necessarily so much the producers. Producers would actually benefit from more protectionism, since that means their competitors would be at a disadvantage. But refiners actually benefit from this exemption. They prefer cheaper imports of foreign energy. Commodities traders, another winner. This comes from the Boolean exemption. Commodities traders make a lot of money trading precious metals, and those are not going to be subject to the tariffs. U.S. steel and aluminum producers also benefit from steel and aluminum tariffs for obvious reasons. It's going to make prices rise in the United States, which is going to have some knock-on effects we'll talk about. But as far as the bottom line for these producers, they should be helpful. Another beneficiary, and this is kind of the yin to the yang of U.S. steel aluminum producers benefiting, foreign steel and aluminum consumers are going to benefit from this. Because the result of the U.S. making it more expensive to sell foreign steel and aluminum in the United States is going to be cheaper steel and aluminum abroad. So if you are a consumer of steel and aluminum, probably not the people listening, but if you are a company that uses steel and aluminum in another country, in Europe, Japan, etc., you actually could benefit from these tariffs because one of your key inputs, be it steel or aluminum, if not both, will be cheaper. Hypothetically. And then the last big winner as far as industry is lawyers, specifically trade lawyers. There's going to be a lot of demand for lobbyists to try to get exemptions from the US government. There's going to be a lot of demand for lawyers to set up shell corporations to engage in tariff evasion. And there's going to be a lot of demand for lawyers from companies that are going to be suing the US government, their partners who are going to try to push the cost of tariffs onto them. Lots of lawsuits right now, not only in the public sector, but in the private sector. So lawyers are definitely benefiting from this. They're getting considerable demand for their services. So those are winners. Losers. The electronics industry. In the original announcement of reciprocal tariffs, they were hit hard. Obviously, the more recent exemption kind of gives them relief. However, I still kept them in the loser category because higher tariffs on electronics are apparently still going to happen later? Question mark. Still not entirely sure on that, but that seems to be what the Trump administration is signaling. So they are going to get hit. Certainly, if the Trump administration wants to put more pressure on China, they're going to be one of the principal ways they do that. Let's see, textiles industry, big loser. Even just the baseline 10% tariffs are going to be a problem for them because lots of textiles producers abroad operate with fairly fairly small profit margins. So a 10% increase in costs actually does hurt them fairly substantively. Automotive industry, this kind of speaks for itself. The United States has imposed car tariffs on everybody. And so that's obviously going to hurt not only car companies that import cars from abroad to sell in the United States, but also people who import lots of car parts. And it's going to get worse once the tariffs on car parts actually get implemented. It's also worth noting that because of the baseline tariffs and potentially also the higher reciprocal tariffs, if they end up getting implemented after the 90-day pause, are going to further hurt the U.S. automotive industry by making it more expensive to import heavy machinery. Like I mentioned before, a lot of machine tools well, actually, I did mention this before. A lot of major machine tools are produced by European companies and Japanese companies. And so raising tariffs on those is going to make them more expensive. And in turn, it's going to be more expensive for US automakers to expand their factories or to build new factories. So the automotive industry in the US is getting hit just everywhere. There's going to be less demand for their products, both in the United States because of the overall effects of all the tariffs that have been implemented, but also they're going to lose export markets because of retaliation. The inputs for their cars are going to be more expensive because of tariffs on car parts, as well as on steel and aluminum. And then heavy machinery used to make them also more expensive. So there's automotive industry may be the biggest loser here overall, once you take into account the aggregate effect of all of the different tariffs and then primary and secondary effects. Another loser here is sort of consumer staples generally, and obviously this is not going to apply universally to all consumer staples, but some of the big ones that are going to be negatively impacted are cosmetics, furniture, home appliances, tools, cutlery, toys, perfume, white goods. If you don't know what white goods are, those are sort of like big household machinery. So your dishwasher, your washer, your dryer, your dishwasher, etc. Stuff like that that's in your kitchen, pretty much. Retailers are going to lose. This basically mirrors select consumer staples listed above. Lots of retailers buy a lot of their basic consumer items from Chinese producers, as also from Southeast Asia. And so insomuch as tariffs are going to severely disrupt the flow of those goods, retailers are going to take a big hit. Luxury goods, probably most people listening don't give a shit about this one, but for the sake of completion, the market for luxury goods, specifically the industry in the US producing luxury goods, will take a hit. Swiss watches, handbags, Swiss chocolate, French wine, jewelry, all of that stuff is going to go up in price because of the tariffs. That may benefit them in terms of greater market share, but it is going to raise prices for the market as a whole. And Chinese retaliation, more importantly, is going to severely curb their access to the Chinese market. And that's especially important because the Chinese market not only is a large market for these companies, but it's also a large growth market. So a good chunk of their total stock evaluation actually comes from sales growth in China. So in so much as that's going to come to an end, they're not only going to get hit in terms of their bottom line, they're going to hit in terms of the overall value of the companies, which is going to be very painful for shareholders.
How are farmers making it out?
Let's see. Farmers, yeah, they're on the list of losers too. I just haven't gotten to them yet.
Damn.
Retaliation is going to reduce access to foreign markets. Also, interest rates may go up as a result of inflation, which is going to hurt them because they borrow a lot for farming equipment, for fertilizer, for fuel, etc. Just a natural part of farming involves borrowing a certain amount of money. So if rates do end up getting hiked because of inflation stemming from tariffs and related trade policy, that's going to hurt them disproportionately. I had a caveat for farmers. If energy prices in global markets fall because of lower economic activity that stems from tariffs, that could reduce their energy costs. So maybe that the fuel they buy becomes cheaper for that reason. I don't think that's going to make up for the loss of markets and demand and whatnot, but it'll mitigate it a little bit. The financial sector is a loser here. They've, again, as stated before, in the immediate announcement of the tariffs, they lost $6 trillion. The New York Stock Exchange specifically lost $6 trillion. And there's potential for retaliation from trade partners that could hurt the financial sector in the US even more, depending on how they want to do it. We talked last time extensively about the points of leverage the European Union has over the United States in that regard. Bonds took a hit. There was some capital flight after the April 9th implementation of tariffs that was then delayed. bond markets have recovered somewhat since then, but they seem to be in danger here. They do not seem to be benefiting from the tariff regime. Insurers are also going to lose out because of tariffs on importation of car parts and also medical devices. Insurance in the United States stands to become more expensive because these things are going to get more expensive because of the tariffs, and in turn, it's going to be more expensive for insurers to pay their clients and cover their claims. That in turn is going to translate most likely to either lower profit margins or higher premiums to consumers. Either way, it should cut into their bottom line. US manufacturing generally is going to be a loser here. Steel and aluminum tariffs are going to make inputs more expensive, as discussed previously. Capital equipment more expensive, retaliation, reducing market access. All of that is bad news if you're an exporting US manufacturer. Tourism is going to be a loser. Canadian, European tourism is nosediving right now. That's not just because of the trade conflict, but because of basically rule of law concerns in the United States. That's weird to say, but that's kind of where we are. And like I said, US farmers as well. So there's a third category here beyond winners and losers, which is the industries that are going to experience a lateral move. In other words, industries that are going to lose a little but also win a little, so it's not entirely clear what the net effect is going to be. So one, electrical equipment. China's a big exporter of electrical equipment, but the US government has been systematically trying to force the private sector to not buy from Chinese sellers, to try to diversify away from them. So I don't know that cutting off Chinese exporters is necessarily going to have too big an impact. Healthcare overall, not entirely clear what the impact is going to be. The fact that pharmaceuticals got an exemption was a big benefit for the healthcare sector in the United States. However, tariffs on medical devices imported from Southeast Asia and China in particular is going to hurt a lot. And I would point out the medical devices imported from China have no exemptions. They're getting hit with that full 150% whatever tariff that the United States has on China right now. So this is a big problem for the healthcare sector in the US. So we'll see how it all evens out in the long run. What few US producers of rare earths there are, this is kind of a lateral move for them too. They got an exemption, which means there's still, that is to say, rare earths got an exemption. So that means that US producers of rare earths are still subject to Chinese competition, which favors the Chinese competition. They would much rather have the protection. However, Chinese retaliation may yet tilt the playing field in their favor. That is to say, they may lose various buyers of Chinese rare earths may lose access to those, and that in turn may redirect demand to U.S. producers. There's not enough productive capacity to cover all of that if that actually happened, but in so much as there is existing productive capacity, the firms that control it will get more of that demand, and they'll make more money. So kind of a lateral move here for that industry, depending on how things shake out. Renewable energy. So China is a major source for solar panels and batteries to the United States. So the tariffs obviously are going to make those more expensive. They did get an exemption technically, so this is a little bit dated. But it's also possible that these could just be tariffed in future. The admin, again, has been very cagey about what the more recently announced exemptions are going to look like in a month or two. But that said, domestic producers in the United States of solar panels and batteries have actually been increasing their market share over time. That's partly because of U.S. industrial policy. The Inflation Reduction Act diverted a lot of resources, both in terms of investor incentives and in terms of direct subsidies to renewable energy firms. And so that has actually been fairly successful. The growth in market share has been slow but steady. And so what that means is that if there is significant disruption to the supply of Chinese solar panels, batteries, et cetera, there actually is a domestic US market that could readily pick that demand up. Now, the caveat here is that the administration has announced that it wants to abandon the Biden-era industrial policies. So that advantage may yet go away. They could, that is to say, domestic producers could end up losing market share if they lose access to all of the subsidies that they've been enjoying, in which case they're definitely going to become a loser. But for now, it's kind of a mixed bag, depending on how the exemption shakes out over the next couple months. Grocers. I'm sure this one will be an item near and dear to the hearts of many people concerned about food inflation in the United States. So I broke grocer into subcategories. So some foods are going to experience inflation, some are not, and some are going to be kind of a third category of mostly unaffected. So overall, the impact of tariffs on grocers is a little bit mixed, but I think it might be of interest to look at specific foods to kind of get an idea. So mostly unaffected will be vegetables, corn, and beef. In so much as the United States imports these, it's mostly from Mexico. And the Trump administration has already exempted goods covered by CUSMA rules of origin from tariffs. So these should be able to continue to enter the United States without issue. And so shouldn't be any impact there. Beer and fruit juice also should be mostly unaffected. These are mostly imported from Mexico and mostly imported from Mexico and Canada. And again, these are covered by CUSMA. However, I had a caveat here. Aluminum tariffs are going to make canning these things, beer and fruit juice, more expensive. So there will be some effect there. But overall, the goods themselves should not be subject to tariffs. Now, clearly more expensive. These are items that tariffs are going to just obviously make more expensive, or at least there will be inflationary pressure that will have to be channeled somewhere. Fruit, bananas, especially out of season fruits of various kinds, those are going to go up in price. 10% tariffs on most of Latin America, which is where the U.S. buys most of its fruit from. 10% isn't a whole lot, so that's not necessarily too impactful, but it is going to be inflationary. Candy, chocolate's going to get more expensive. And West Africa and Switzerland, big sources of chocolate and chocolate candy in the United States, did get hit with tariffs. Only 10% for now, but potentially over 30% going forward. So candy is going to get hit. Coffee, also going to get hit. Only 10%, not too bad. But Colombia and Brazil are major exporters to the U.S., and they got 10% tariffs. Imported tea from places like Sri Lanka, India, China, that's going to get hit. There are alternatives, especially to Chinese tea, that are getting hit with much lower tariffs than the 150% on China. So there could be some trade diversion there that mitigates the price increase. But in general, that'll go up in price. Probably most of you don't drink a lot of imported tea, so you don't really care about that. I do, at least some. So it bothers me. So maybe that's just more me complaining. Vanilla ice cream, that's going to get more expensive. The U.S. imports a lot of vanilla extract from Madagascar. And that got hit with 10%. And if the reciprocal tariffs do end up going through, Madagascar is going to get hit with, I think, like 30 to 40% tariffs.
Yeah, they were one of the red ones on the map.
Yeah. Now, that will be mitigated somewhat. There was a cyclone that wiped out a good chunk of Madagascar's vanilla trees about 10 years ago, and that had a big inflationary impact on vanilla for a while. And the result is that the market actually adapted to that by finding artificial alternatives to vanilla. Some people complained the artificial alternatives were not as good, but they are there as an alternative if the price of natural vanilla spikes. And so I think with that experience in mind, I think the market is in a decent position to pivot very quickly from Madagascar exports of vanilla if it needs to. So it could be that this is one of the less disruptive changes that happens. Do you drink Fiji water, Neuro?
No, overpriced for the quality.
I'm inclined to agree, but that's actually imported from Fiji, and that is going to get tariffed as well.
No, I know people who love that stuff. It looks very happy. Their marketing is great. I like the bottle design.
Yeah, Fiji actually got one of the higher tariff rates. I think it was like around 30%. Right now it's just 10, but if the reciprocal tariffs do go through as announced, it will end up being around 30. So anybody who drinks Fiji water is going to feel that most likely.
It's pretty good. Like I would say Fiji water of different bottled water you can get, that's definitely upper tier. It's definitely expensive. So I think there's other stuff on the upper tier that's more economical than Fiji, and I'm also not super picky, but it's good water. Chad, what's your opinion? That's unfortunate for them because it's, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't imagine Fiji exports a whole lot. So anything that hits them in a critical industry is going to be disproportionately impactful there. Seafood will become more expensive. I'm sure everybody's familiar with the Falkland Islands by now. So lots of minor producers of fish and other forms of seafood, they're all hit with the 10%, potentially much higher in the future. And so everything from seafood restaurants on to food processors that deal with seafood, they should be raising their prices or otherwise finding ways to channel higher priced seafood. And also, as a final note, among the stuff that's going to get more expensive, Asian food, just broadly speaking, boba, seaweed, etc. A lot of that tends to be imported from places like Taiwan or Japan. So in so much as they're going to get hit with either 10% or the much higher rates that East Asia got in the initial announcement of reciprocal tariffs, all of that specialized ethnic food you import from those places are going to get much more expensive. So that's the more expensive list. There is a very short list of items that will be less expensive. Wheat, soybeans, nuts, and derivatives thereof, various food products that use these as ingredients, like nut bars, bread, etc. That stuff will actually get cheaper. That'll mostly be because of retaliation. If the exporters of these items lose market share in foreign exports, they're going to start redirecting their production inward, back into the U.S. market. That's going to increase supply and lower prices.
Big bread about to take over.
Well, they're still going to lose money, but for consumers, it'll be beneficial. Okay, that's winners and losers by industry. Winners and losers by country. So the GCC, these are the Gulf countries in the Middle East. They obviously won out. Their major export item is oil, and they got an exemption to energy. So big win for them. Taiwan, a winner. Semiconductors, obviously a target, but semiconductors also got an exemption. Other exporters in Taiwan are still getting hit with the 10% and potentially, I think, like a 30 to 40% if that ends up happening. So that's disruptive for them. But the main item for them is semiconductor exports, and that's not getting hit at all. So big win for them. India, a winner. Major export item to the United States is pharmaceuticals. Those were exempted. Iran, Venezuela, winners, bizarrely. Their main export item is energy, and that was exempted. So they're only, beyond that, subject to the 10% tariffs. Horn of Africa, Central Africa, Great Lakes region of Africa, West African countries that don't produce oil, and Egypt. All of these regions and countries in Africa, big winners. Why? Tariffs impact some of their commodity exports to the U.S., but they're actually going to gain from cheaper finished goods that are redirected from the U.S. So they're going to lose some exports to the United States, but the overall impact of the trade war with China is going to be redirection of manufactured goods in China intended for the United States to the rest of the world. And so those manufactured goods should become cheaper. And so places, that is to say, consumers in the countries listed here, as well as many other countries, are going to benefit in general for broadly cheaper manufacturing goods in the short to medium term. South America, winner, baseline 10% will hurt, but they're going to benefit from the cheaper finished goods redirected from China as well. But a bigger benefit for them is going to be a boost to their own agricultural exports. U.S. agricultural exports are going to fall. They're going to lose market access, and their market share is going to fall, and it will be replaced and taken up by South American exporters. We've already seen this with the first Trump administration. One of the big impacts of the trade war then is that U.S. agricultural exporters lost market share in China specifically to South American producers. So history seems likely to repeat in that regard, and that will be to South America's benefit. Kazakhstan, Guyana, South Africa, and then also West African oil producers. Also winners because, again, energy was exempted, and their main, well, in so much as they're producing oil, they're benefiting from that exemption. Guyana, Angola oil, Kazakhstan crude oil. Kazakhstan also apparently exports silver, a fair amount. And like I mentioned earlier, bullion trade was exempted. So Kazakhstan benefits from that. South Africa also exports a significant amount of precious metals like platinum, etc. And so they benefit from the bullion exemption as well. I did have it noted here that South Africa apparently does export some cars to the United States, much to my surprise. And so those are going to obviously take a big hit. So that's a big loss for them. But overall, the precious metals trade, I think, is more important for their exports to the United States. So I think they come out a winner there. Cayman Islands and Singapore, those are going to be havens for shell companies and re-export activity. So they're going to be winners. And potentially Northern Ireland, very specifically, could be a winner. Northern Ireland right now has a very weird setup. It's technically part of the UK, which got relatively lower tariffs in the initial tariff schedule released. But it is technically part of the European single market still. So there's potential for a bunch of re-export trade there. Europe, in the initial reciprocal tariff announcement, had 20% tariffs, whereas the UK only had 10. Now, right now, everybody just has the 10, so this is a moot point for the moment. But if the European Union does end up having the 20% tariffs applied to it, as originally announced by Washington, the UK then will only have 10%. And so there's an incentive to take European goods that have been exported directly to the United States and send them instead to Northern Ireland and have them exported from there, where they will be subject only to the 10% tariff on the UK. Now, given that there's a significant amount of goods in the European Union that are exported to the United States that would be subject to that 20% tariff, there is then significant financial incentive to redirect trade through Northern Ireland to get that 10% lower rate. So Northern Ireland, if it does see that happen, will see an immense increase in trade going through its territory, and that could generate immense revenue for them. Okay, losers by country. China, Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, Pakistan. These are probably the hardest hit countries. Many of their main exports to U.S. will be hit hard. These include steel, light manufacturing, electronics, renewables, and textiles, among other industries. Mexico and Canada. This stems from the automotive tariffs, also tariffs that are going to impact aeronautics trade, steel and aluminum tariffs. All of these are going to be disruptive for Mexico and Canada. They still have something, they still benefit from trade from the United States that is exempted due to the CUSMA exemption that was announced. So that is kind of a win for them. And I do have a caveat here, which is that energy and agricultural exports will be safe. Partly that's the CUSMA exemption, but partly it's also just the energy exemption that I keep mentioning. Mm-hmm. So not entirely a disaster for them, but automotive, aeronautics, steel, aluminum industries are important employers, and they're going to take a hit. So I put them in the loser category. Japan and South Korea, losers, stems from automotive exports being imperiled by car tariffs. The caveat here is that they export a lot of semiconductors and also rare gases that are used in semiconductor production. Both of these, I think, got exemptions. So that is going to mitigate the pain a little bit. But cars are going to be more important, I think, as far as exports to the United States. So I think on the net, they're going to be hurt by this. Europe is a loser because of tariffs on automotive exports, machinery, and also high-value agriculture. That's just a term I use to refer to like wine, fancy cheeses, stuff like that.
Bougie shit.
Bougie shit, yeah. Israel and Australia lost. That's not necessarily because of trade, but more so because they made a bunch of initial concessions before the announcement of the tariffs was even made in the hopes of avoiding them, and it didn't work. So they tried to play nice, they tried to play ball, and it just blew up in their faces. Syria is a loser for some reason. They got tariffs in the initial reciprocal tariff announcement of over 40%, even higher than Afghanistan and Iran, despite the fact that they just are a war-torn country that can't import anything, really. There's not enough market demand for them to import any significant amount of stuff at the moment. They are in recovery. That could yet happen, but for the moment, they're not anywhere near being able to import as much as they export. Certainly not to the United States, which still has sanctions on them. So fuck Syria, I guess, for some reason.
Well, you said some of the other countries that we have sanctions on, they were exempt from this because of the sanctions, but Syria, tariff them anyway.
Yeah, Syria gets sanctioned, tariffed anyway. Iran, for that matter, lots of sanctions, still got tariffed. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me, but I don't think it's necessarily meant to, for reasons we've discussed at length already. Fuck Lesotho as well. They export a lot of genes to the United States, but their exports are going to get hit with 10% at least, potentially 49%. I think Lesotho had like among the highest in the initial announcement. And as I've discussed before, Southern Africa also hit disproportionately hard. They're a loser here because they export so many commodities while not having enough economic development to import as much. So invariably, they're going to get hit hard. All the more so because their economies are primarily dependent on those commodity exports. Bangladesh, I already mentioned them. I don't know why it's here twice. A joke answer, penguins. The penguins lose because we're tariffing the Howard and McDonald Islands. Okay,
Chat
so those are the
penguins
losers.
already.
Sorry, what?
Chat mentioned the penguins just a
Yeah.
bit ago.
That's the joke. It's been making the rounds on the internet. So that's losers by country. Okay, so winners and losers done with. Secondary effects. We may have to have a part 3.
Oh, no.
Tariffs. The saga.
Okay, secondary effects. So first, I'm just going to list different types of effects because I'm not going to have examples for each of them. You know, again, I'm just like one fat guy living in his mom's basement. I can't go through each and every item that the world produces and do analysis on it. So I'm going to list types of effects, and you can kind of use that on your own when you want to understand secondary effects and what secondary effects the tariffs in particular are going to have. And then I'll get into specific examples. Okay, so some types of secondary effects include trade diversion, which is basically just where if one item that you're importing gets more expensive because of tariffs, then you start buying it from someplace else. So you're not necessarily buying local producers, although you could, but you may just import from somebody else. And in turn, that could involve, on the other party's side, exporting to somebody else. So this is just trade diversion. Automation. So if you do successfully incentivize people or just incentivize people to buy domestically, or if you just cut off all foreign options entirely, probably through some draconian measure, you're going to incentivize automation, especially if you're a developed country, because that's basically the only way you can make up for the difference in labor costs between a developed country and a developing country. So in so much as that's economically viable, that is a secondary effect that will play out, in at least with some goods. Innovation. So sometimes it's not really about automation per se. Sometimes it's just about finding or inventing an alternative good to replace an import. So the example I have is from World War II. The United States lost access to much of its rubber imports as a result of Japan invading East Asia. And that was a big problem because most of the rubber used in the United States at that time was imported, specifically from the region that Japan invaded, that being Southeast Asia.
And by rubber, you mean all rubber, not just condoms.
Yes. Indeed. But, what was it? Oh, right. So what they did is that they actually created synthetic rubber. They actually had some scientists develop it. I think it was already kind of all in development, but they scaled it up and started mass producing synthetic rubber to substitute for the imported rubber that they had lost access to. So innovation is also another secondary effect here. Another effect is substitute goods. Basically, this is just when, and this is kind of just an economic thing, not just a trade thing, but it plays out in trade too. This is sort of the economics version of trade diversion. So if one good becomes more expensive and there's another good that's very similar, but not exactly the same, you could just substitute the cheaper alternative good for the other one. Now, don't misunderstand. I'm not talking about different brands of the same type of good. I'm talking about different categories of good that kind of fulfill the same function, but that are different. So that's more what I'm talking about here. There's also complementary goods. So a complementary good is a good that you buy with another good. And invariably, prices and demand for complementary goods generally moves in unison. You can think of something like toothbrushes and toothpaste, for example. If you're using one, you are most likely, unless you're very strange, using the other one. And so they tend to move in tandem. So substitute effects and complementary goods, substitute goods and complementary goods, similar to trade diversion. But here with complementary goods, I'm talking more in terms of knock-on effects. In terms of substitute effects and substitute goods and complementary goods, I'm focusing more specifically on secondary effects. I'll give it a specific example of complementary goods and tariffs in a little bit. I'm sure that's all very confusing. Bear with me. And then finally, effects on producers. So this is things like exiting a market, decreasing production, etc. And partly that stuff is itself a function of industrial organization, which is a fancy way of saying market concentration. So if the result of tariffs is that producing a good becomes sufficiently unprofitable, it may not be that domestic producers rush in to take up the market share lost by foreign producers. It could just be that producers abandon the market entirely. That's what market exit is. And if that's what happens, then you don't see more expensive domestically made goods. You're going to just see no goods. Producers will just leave, and consumers will just be left to kind of deal with that how they may. Decreasing production, that's just a natural, fallout from falling prices or increasing costs, and that'll have knock-on effects in terms of employment, et cetera. So these are just different secondary effects. Substitute goods, complementary goods, kind of just generic economic concept that's relevant here. And again, I'll try to explain that a little better with the examples, but these are all different types of secondary effects, and so this is what you can kind of think of if you want to try to apply this to individual goods or industries. Okay, so specific examples. Primary market, natural rubber. Already kind of talked about this. But an example of trade diversion here would be shifting from rubber producers in Thailand and Indonesia to rubber producers in Ivory Coast and Liberia. Now, this is assuming that the initially announced tariffs end up getting implemented. If it's just a flat 10%, you're not going to see this. But as was, Thailand and Indonesia both had tariffs applied to them in the initial announcement of over 30%. Ivory Coast, 21%, Liberia, 10%, much lower. Correspondingly, if you want to import rubber, you're going to shift to the countries that have the lower tariff. So that's an example of trade diversion, secondary effect. Fruit and bananas, the secondary effect here is going to be more demand for fruit that's made in California and Florida where possible. And that's an important item. It's going to be tariffs on these items as far as secondary effects. It's just going to be a deadweight loss for fruits which have no domestic alternative. So if there's a type of fruit you can't grow here because of the climate or soil that you just have to import, there's not going to be a domestic alternative that crops up. You're just going to have to pay more for the imported item. It's especially going to be a deadweight loss for off-season fruits, because even in the case of fruits you can grow here, there's going to be some seasons when you can't grow it, and in those cases, you just have to pay more for imported variants. Automation, there's going to be more demand for automated fruit picking tech, which is, I don't think, ever really reached scale or become especially profitable. But whenever there's a big shock like this, an economic shock, invariably there's renewed interest. So probably investors will take another look at it. Another secondary effect here regarding fruit, more demand for illegal immigrant fruit pickers, probably. If there is more demand for American-made fruit, there's going to be more production. More production means more need for fruit pickers, and those are almost always immigrants. So ironically, the Trump administration may be incentivizing illegal immigrants to come into the United States with this one. Again, secondary effect. As far as industrial organization in the fruit industry, I actually looked up price elasticity of demand, I think specifically for bananas, and apparently it is pretty inelastic. In general, market concentration for distributors is relatively high, low for growers, unless it's a banana plantation, in which case it's quite high. Profit margins are relatively high for just fruit in general. So the conclusion I drew then is that the industry can raise prices without losing revenue on account of the price inelasticity of the product. And there's little competitive pressure to avoid price increases on account of market concentration in the industry. So most likely, consumers are going to eat the bulk of the tariff costs here, if not all of them. Growers and distributors are not going to absorb it at all, would be my guess. Okay, chocolate. Dead weight loss, can't really grow it in the United States. It's just going to get more expensive. There could be a shift away from Ivory Coast to other West African producers of chocolate. This is because in the initial reciprocal tariff announcement, everybody in West Africa had 10%, except for a couple of countries, including Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast is easily the largest chocolate exporter. So if the reciprocal tariffs, as initially announced, do go forward, there's probably going to be a big shift away from Ivorian chocolate towards chocolate produced in other West African countries. Let's see. Producers of chocolate candy may reduce the chocolate content of that candy in order to save money. Artificial chocolate may get another look. Apparently there was in the 70s an experiment with synthetic chocolate alternatives. Some of them were made from sunflower seed. There was another one that was famously made of caboa, which apparently tasted like ass. But they may try that again if prices increase significantly. I would point out here, and I think I mentioned this last time, chocolate prices have already been skyrocketing over the past couple of years on account of issues with climate, as well as with just the market mechanisms by which the chocolate is sold. That's a domestic political thing in West Africa. And so I think the statistic was that chocolate prices have risen something like 300 to 400% over the past 5 to 10 years. So tariffs are not going to jack up prices that much. It's, again, 10%, maybe 21% in the case of Ivory Coast. But they will have an inflationary effect that will exacerbate that. But that also, I would point out, all of that 400% inflation, whatnot, that's already kind of incentivizing synthetic chocolate. I'm pretty sure the market is probably already looking at that. Let's see, wheat, soybeans, nuts, lower prices from loss of export markets, like I mentioned. One of the secondary effects is that farms will shift to higher value crops that are not experiencing price decreases. I don't know enough about agriculture to know exactly what they would switch to. I would guess cash crops, maybe stuff like cotton, if the climate is appropriate for it. Maybe nuts of one, well, nuts are in the thing here, but other kinds of nuts that maybe are not exported to China, what few there may be, they may get another look. Also, market exit. There's going to be smaller farms that just shut down. There's already an agricultural recession in the United States. That particular part of the economy is really struggling, has been for some time on account of inflation. This tariff stuff is just going to make it worse. So there's likely to be market exits that result from this. Beverages, pressure to substitute glass bottles for aluminum cans on account of aluminum tariffs. That could increase demand for glass and sand with corresponding price increases that have knock-on effects for things like construction, for example, which itself uses a lot of glass and sand. Deadweight loss for French wine and champagnes. You guys probably don't drink a lot of that, but there's not really there's no local substitute for it. There is wine and champagne grown in the United States, but it's not French wine and champagne. So for that, there's no obvious substitute. So more expensive. Let's see, coffee. That's just a dead weight loss. You can't produce it here. You also can't, as a substitute good, you can think of tea as a substitute good for coffee. You can't switch to tea as a substitute good because that's getting tariffed too, and probably by the same amount for the most part. An example of a complementary good here, creamer. So if you buy coffee, you may use creamer in your coffee. As a result, the markets for creamer and coffee often move in parallel. So if the coffee industry sells less coffee in the United States, creamer too will take a hit, and that will have a corresponding knock-on negative effect on the dairy industry in the United States. Incidentally, I actually did look up the price elasticity of coffee, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it is in fact very inelastic, meaning that demand is not going to change much relative to changes in price. So most likely then the tariffs are not going to mean much as far as demand for coffee. You will have to pay more for it, but apparently consumers don't really care about price changes. They got to have their coffee. So what that means is that creamer is probably not going to take much of a hit here. Let's see, ice cream, we already talked about that. As far as secondary effects, synthetic alternatives to vanilla will probably be looked at. I already mentioned that earlier, but another example of a secondary effect. Seafood, secondary effect here is going to vary by fish. In some cases, there's domestic alternatives that you can embrace. In some cases, there's just not, and you're going to take a dead weight loss. In other cases, there might be more innovation. There might be more look at things like, what's it called? They have a fancy name for it, aquatic farming, something like that. Basically just farms where they raise seafood, like in the actual ocean. It's been a growth market for some time. They're still working out all of the kinks. There are still some problems. Pollution is particularly a problem, not just because it pollutes the environment, but also because it kills the fish, which obviously you don't want. But it is growing. That is a technology that is getting refined, and so this could significantly boost interest in that. Fiji water again. This is another example of substitute goods. The market for bottled water is pretty large. You have lots of different, in this case, this is about brands. You have different brands that you can switch to, and probably a lot of them are domestic, so this could be a successful example of demand being shifted to domestic producers. So that's primary sector stuff. Now secondary sector stuff. Medical devices, I already kind of mentioned this. There's not a lot of short-term alternatives. So there's probably, I expect, as a secondary effect, going to be a lot of tariff evasion. So there's not a lot, not a lot of alternatives in the short term. It's going to be easier just to try to route it through other countries and then lie about the origin. I suspect that's going to end up being the solution in the short term. Let's see, that could result in greater investment in third-party countries, especially Southeast Asia. If Southeast Asia only gets the baseline 10% going forward, and China still gets like the stick, the 150% tariffs, that's actually going to significantly incentivize the re-export market there. So that could lead to a lot more investment in medical device production in Southeast Asia by Chinese producers of those goods to try to get around American tariffs. Car parts. Possible outcomes include reshoring. Since some of those products there are probably some car parts that can be produced in a capital-intensive way, as opposed to a labor-intensive way in a developing country. So for those parts, you probably will see some reshoring. Again, depending on how ephemeral the tariff regime ends up being. Another possible outcome, cost increases could be absorbed by workers in the form of lower wages. Wage suppression could be the result of this, depending on the market, depending on market power of individual firms. which is how they derive their power to impose changes in wages on their workers. More market power, more market concentration means that you have more power over the workers, basically. In general, obviously, labor supply plays a role of that as well. Let's see, another possible outcome. Producers could just try to find cheaper foreign imports, that is to say, producers of cars. So they may switch from Mexican producers, Chinese producers, etc., to producers in Southeast Asia or India. And another secondary effect, it could be that the cost of the tariffs is just split evenly between supplier, car maker, and consumer, such that the burden doesn't fall disproportionately on any one. Now, I had some extra notes here on the car parts and cars, since cars seem to be a particular fixation of the administration. One, most car parts in the United States are already American-made. Apparently, only 1/3 of car parts in U.S. cars, that is to say, cars in the United States, were made outside of the United States. And about 10% of U.S. car parts, again, these are car parts in cars in the United States, only about 10% of those were made in Canada. So reshoring from these places from abroad is not going to reshore necessarily a whole lot. It's actually a minority of the market that you're trying to reshore by doing that. And that doesn't mean people should invariably give up on it. Whether or not people want it or not is up to them. That's a personal preference thing. But it's not going to be a big dramatic thing where, it's not like we lost 90% of the market for car parts and need to get it back. We lost some of it, maybe a third. Markets for cheap cars, a big driver for offshoring to Canada and Mexico. We've already talked about this, but basically, just to kind of go through it again very quickly. Most of the cars in the United States that are imported, and especially cars, even those that are made in the United States, that are designed, that use a lot of cheap imported car parts, both of those groups generally cater to the lower end of the market. That is to say, they generally sell low-priced cars that are intended for sale to low-income people who are on a budget. So that basically illustrates that the tariffs, in so much as they disproportionately focus on cars and make them more expensive, are mostly going to make cars that are currently cheap more expensive. A lot of the cars that are for a higher end market are actually mostly made in the United States and actually use parts that are mostly made in the United States. So they're actually not all that affected. That is to say, like if you're a rich guy who drives a fancy car, at least one that's not so fancy that it's imported from like Italy or something, you're probably driving a car that was mostly made in America mostly using American-made car parts. Tariffs don't affect you that much. If you're on a budget, if you're minimum wage, low income, what have you, these tariffs, the burden of these tariffs disproportionately falls on you, at least certainly in terms of cars, because it's mostly those low-end cars that are going to be impacted. An example I had of this is mufflers. Mufflers, I looked into a market analysis of mufflers just as a case study. I was curious. And what I read is that a major driver of growth for the muffler market is sale of cheap cars. And that's partly because of quantity. American automakers, again, those that focus on large cars for people with higher incomes, they make more money doing that, but they don't produce that many actual cars. Like the quantity is relatively lower. The quantity of lower end cars is much higher, but the profit correspondingly is much lower because they do have to be cheap. The price level has to be low. And mufflers, in turn, as a cheap good that can be mass produced using cheap labor abroad, is disproportionately dependent on that low end of the market.
Kind of sounds similar to airplane seats between first class and coach. Like they make a lot more money per seat on first class, but there aren't as many seats that are purchased.
Yeah, I think they actually break even on the cheap seats. Like the vast majority of the profit comes from the more expensive seating. Mm-hmm. In fact, probably most of you listening already know about this YouTube channel, but there's a YouTube channel called Windover Productions. and they specialize in like deep dives on individual industries, public policy, etc. It's a very good channel. I don't watch it as much as I should, but I've been following it pretty much from the start, and it's been very good from the start. And they actually did a very good video on this very subject, the subject of how airlines make profits on seats. And one of the things that the author of the video discussed is that originally flying was like a high-end form of transportation. No surprise, like that's normal with new technologies and whatnot. So back in like the 1920s, 30s, generally it was well-off clientele that used planes. There was some increase in availability of seating to budget passengers. But what airlines quickly found out is that they made virtually no money on them. Like the profitability was entirely in servicing the high-end clientele. So what ended up happening is that the US government actually regulated the market and forced air carriers to reserve a certain amount of space on their planes for the cheap seats. In other words, they made them cater to the budget end of the market. If they had not done that, flying would probably still be a premium mode of travel, as in a mode of travel just for well-off people. Because the airlines, they would make way more money doing that. Like saving space for the cheap seats, that actually probably costs them money overall when you account for the opportunity cost of fewer seats for the well-off. So you're absolutely correct that they make more money on the expensive seats, but you're even more right than you know. It actually took an act of government to get them to create any kind of budget seating at all.
Did not know that.
Fun YouTube channel, strong recommend.
Cool.
Let's see, secondary effects, car parts, let's see, industrial goods generally cheaper for the rest of the world as Chinese goods redirected from the US to the rest of the world, already mentioned that. Textiles, let's see, so some secondary effects here, and this is assuming we end up with the higher reciprocal tariffs. The baseline 10% probably won't be enough to make significant waves, although it will definitely make some. For now, the effect of the tariffs is paralysis and let's see, and a consideration of alternatives. Firms right now are kind of waiting to see how things shake out. No surprise. As far as alternatives, and this is the real secondary effect here, the industry is looking at Egypt, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, Indonesia. Right now, most of the industry is in China, Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, and especially Bangladesh. So you could see significant trade diversion if the higher, earlier announced tariffs end up getting implemented. Okay, tertiary sector. We already talked about the effect on insurers. That's an example of a secondary effect. Lower borrowing costs for other countries as the experience. Okay, this one assumes that the US experiences prolonged capital flight. Money that is pulled out of the United States and that is then invested elsewhere is going to push down interest rates for other countries and borrowers generally. So a potential secondary effect here for the tertiary sector for the entire planet could be higher rates in the United States and then lower general rates abroad. And then this is kind of an other category, labor. The dislocation of potentially millions of Chinese laborers who had been working in factories producing for the US market. The secondary effect of doing that is going to be to drive down wages in China. And that's actually going to reinforce their competitive advantage in labor-intensive manufacturing, which is a big reason why they've managed to dominate manufacturing around the world thus far. That's kind of a self-defeating move, but it may not necessarily matter depending on other effects. But that is going to happen. It's probably already happening. And if it ends up being a dramatic impact, it could draw back some textile manufacturing as well as other industries that China has lost over the past 15-some years as its wages have risen, making it less competitive in the most labor-intensive industries, which actually have relocated away from China in that time frame. That's it for secondary effects.
Good job.
Okay, I have a case study. Like I said, the Trump administration is particularly interested in the automotive industry, and in particular, car parts seems to come up a lot. And I've noticed when journalists, as well as the government, talk about car parts, they tend to talk very ambiguously. As an economist, and also just anybody who's familiar with business is going to know that broad categories of goods tend to see a lot of variance in how those individual goods perform in terms of their markets, demand, pricing, et cetera. So there's so many different car parts that putting them all in one basket actually doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I wanted to try to break that down a little bit and get more detailed. And again, just one guide, there's only so much I can do. So what I did is I looked up all of the top imported car parts for the United States. And then I ranked them according to the total value of those imports. And I think the data was from 2021. So I just wanted to briefly go through the list and give you an idea of what specific car parts the United States is importing and presumably wants to reshore into the United States. So again, just to run through them very rapidly, the number one item, body parts. And this apparently excludes cabs for whatever reason. Total value, $15 billion some dollars. Again, 2021 data. Second largest category, probably won't surprise you, all other automotive parts. So the other category, basically. The total value of that is $14 billion.
So what was the
Not
first?
very specific.
What was the first category?
The first one was body parts. Sorry, what?
Yeah, it was body parts.
Yeah, body parts.
Oh.
Top item easily. But then there's so many others that the other category is huge and actually ends up being the second largest item on the list.
Is the body part stuff like chassis, wheels? What does that mean?
I assume it's frame.
Okay.
That is my understanding of body part, but I'm not the guy to ask. I'm not a car guy. Okay, first two, body parts, all other. Third item on the list, gearboxes, $8 billion. Brakes and parts, $5.6 billion. Drive axles with differential, $4.8 billion. Lighting, $4.3 billion. Wheels and parts, $4.2 billion. Shock absorbers, $4.1 billion. Steering parts, $3.8 billion. Radios, $2.1 billion. Other mountings and fittings, $2.1 billion. Airbags, $1.7 billion. And then without listing the values, all of the rest are around $1.5 billion or less. Parts for lighting, wipers or defrosters, clutches and parts, starters, bumpers and parts, generators and other generator parts, mufflers and exhaust, radiators, vehicle locks, spark plugs, distributors and ignition coils, rear view mirrors, other miscellaneous radios, other miscellaneous parts for lighting, wipers or defrosters, seat belts, seats, tempered safety glass, horns, other ignition parts, brake lining and pads, wipers and defrosters, and then finally magnetos and flywheels. Now, some of the value for these is going to get double counted because some of these kind of cross the border multiple times. But in general, this is the stuff that we're talking about when we talk about car parts. And it's the production of this stuff that the Trump administration seems to be fighting for.
All about them car parts and rare earths.
Now, I also visited the Observatory of Economic Complexity. They had some statistics that I thought were interesting, specifically regarding car parts. So the United States, contrary to what people might think, actually is a major exporter of car parts. The exports for 2023 was $41.1 billion worth. Now, to give you an idea of where that sits in comparison with other major exporters of car parts, Germany is at $69.4 billion, and they're number one easily. China, $49.1 billion. Mexico, $49.1 billion. Japan, $28.9 billion. So the United States is a major player in car part exports already. It's not as though the industry completely collapsed and we have nothing. Again, we already produce a lot for many of our higher priced vehicles that are made in the United States. and we're already export competitive in a number of other car parts, as you can see in this data. The catch here is that US car part imports are way higher than everybody else, $88 billion worth in 2023. So that's a total deficit in car parts of $47 billion in 2023. However, I would point out that this has more to do with the size of the US market, as well as the dominance in the low-cost car market that is controlled largely by foreign car makers in the United States.
I see the motive here.
Yeah. So because we're such a large market, we invariably are going to import a lot in absolute terms. And because American automakers have basically abandoned low-cost cars, a big chunk of the market now is in foreign hands, which invariably means more imports.
It's interesting. One of the things that maybe people who don't live in the US haven't seen or felt is the relative use of cars we have compared to other forms of transportations like trains and buses. The automotive industry is huge in the US, and we have a lot of big roads that are very navigable. So buying a big vehicle doesn't inconvenience at all. Whereas in a lot of other countries, if you buy a massive truck, like I'm talking a Texas truck, you're fucked in a lot of situations in small old towns. The roads just aren't that big. The lanes aren't that big. And you end up just inconveniencing yourself and other people around you. Whereas in the US, we have huge roads, and we don't really have good rail transport from place to place. Like there are some that are popping up, but relatively speaking, if you want to go state to state, you're probably either going to fly or drive a car. And a lot of families will have multiple motor vehicles, whereas in other countries, maybe you just share one because your location is more navigable by foot or bicycling or something.
Bingo.
Yeah.
So that's just kind of a snapshot. I kind of bring that up to illustrate that the United States is not getting quote unquote screwed in terms of car parts. Like we actually are a major producer. We are competitive. So even if the Trump administration is fairly successful here in reshoring, it's not necessarily going to translate into big benefits.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the car and car parts case study. I wanted to trot that out just to kind of give a little bit of detail and elaboration to the car parts conversation that is happening right now in U.S. politics that doesn't really receive much nuance, specifically the nuance that it deserves, because this is a very broad category of goods. Okay. How are we doing on time?
Been going for 2 hours, 37 minutes.
All right.
He's cooking.
I've got some takeaways, and then I've got the critique section. There's no way we can finish the critique section, so that's probably going to be part 3.
Okay.
But I think I can get through the takeaways section. So these are just broad conclusions that I drew based off of everything that I've been talking about today and then last time. 1, tariffs will probably have a relatively mild effect on grocery bills. There's going to be some inflation, but a lot of America's major trading partners, as far as food and whatnot, are covered by KUSMA, so they shouldn't be impacted too much. So fears on this count, fears that the tariffs are going to cause massive inflation as far as your, monthly budget for regular people. In terms of food, that may end up being unfounded, even if the worst of the tariffs go forward as they've been announced thus far. And no doubt the government will benefit from that. 2, the tariffs double down on drive to reshore chips manufacturing. All of the exemptions kind of illustrate that. The ultimate outcome, though, is still going to depend on whether or not the administration scraps subsidies that were implemented during the Biden administration. Those are a pretty important part of the reshoring effort. And if the industry loses those, we're going to be in much more ambiguous territory as far as the trend line there. Renewables are going to get squeezed in the short term, but in the medium to long term, it could be to the benefit of domestic producers. This will be an opportunity for them to scale up, as previously mentioned. Again, this is partly hostage to the Trump administration's position on the subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's see. Immense uncertainty for automakers. Yeah, again, like I said before, they're getting fucked every which way. So they're especially hurt by this. Another item, budget consumers are going to get railed. So specifically, rural consumers, minorities, and young people in the United States are going to be disproportionately negatively impacted by the tariffs. Budget cars, as we've just discussed, are going to be disproportionately impacted. Consumer staples will take a broad hit. So all of the basic stuff people buy on a budget, that's going to go up in price. White goods, home appliances, smartphones, clothes, electronics. Obviously, smartphones, electronics have the exemption, but that's probably going to end, I assume, if we take the administration at its word. Fixed incomes in particular will be fucked in the short term, not just because they're on a budget generally, but also because a lot of people on fixed incomes have incomes that are a function of the stock market, and it's pretty significantly declined. It hasn't collapsed, but it's not doing better. And so people who are already retired may have to trim their budget a little bit, and people who are about to retire may have to delay retirement. And then other budget consumers, one of the respites for budget consumers is the energy exemption. So things like gasoline, your heating bill, those should be unaffected. So you should be okay on those counts. Premium consumers probably won't feel the tariffs much. Luxury brands have larger profit margins, so they can afford to kind of absorb more of those tariff costs. And of course, their consumers don't generally care as much about price, so they could probably, if they wanted to pass the prices on, do so without too much consequence. Let's see. Yeah. The sickly and seniors, this is basically just the same thing as fixed incomes, at least as far as seniors, but both sickly and seniors will be hurt by the tariffs in so much as the tariffs affect medical devices. And then also they benefit from the pharma exemption, but that could end at some point, again, going by the administration's statements on the subject. Mixed bag for homeowners. So construction materials and tools are likely to get more expensive. Furniture and white goods will be more expensive. However, lumber got an exemption, and the United States imports a lot from Canada. So that's going to be very beneficial. My understanding is that lumber is a major material as far as housing, especially in the United States. So the other stuff going up in price will hurt, but the lumber exemption is a big dodged bullet for the industry. Farmers, as discussed, they're going to avoid pressure from tariffs on fertilizer. That's going to be covered by CUSMA, but they're going to face big pressure from retaliation. So they're kind of the sacrificial lamb here for the administration. Tech workers and gamers, I'm sure we don't have any listening. They're going to get squeezed. Computers and graphics cards, they're going to be notably more expensive. The electronics exemption is going to mitigate that in the short term. So depending on how that shakes out in the medium to long term, it could get significantly worse or significantly better. A little unclear at this point. Gold bugs always win. They got their Boolean exemption, so they'll be able to continue to hoard gold, as they love to do. And then finally, there's going to be further incentivizing of automation to minimize high labor costs in the United States for reshored firms, and adoption of domestic synthetic alternatives where possible. Those are your takeaways. We don't have time for critique, so I'm going to pass on that. And that's going to be it for today as far as trade, then.
Nice. Well, thank you for going through all that and organizing your notes. Good job.
So do we have 10 minutes here?
17 minutes.
17 minutes. Okay. What kind of questions did we have?
I
can see we have some from last week.
Yeah, he said earlier that we had a lot, but whatever you want to tackle, you can also knock out easy ones if you want to just skim.
All right. Just a second.
All good. We've been talking a lot. Water is something I support.
Okay. I'd like Smith's take on the deals with other countries that are being made to ostensibly avoid tariffs, and the idea that Trump is allegedly using tariffs to achieve lower trade barriers through these deals. We already talked today about the different negotiations that are happening, so I would defer to that. As far as whether or not the administration is using tariffs to achieve lower trade barriers, that's sort of the trade balancing theory, that the secret objective here is to try to balance out trade between the U.S. and foreign partners because of alleged structural inequality in the international trading relationship. That's possible. There's some evidence for that in the form of the Besant document that was previously discussed last week. I don't really buy it. I am immensely skeptical. My theory, as previously discussed, is that the administration isn't all that serious about this and is mostly trying to go for low-hanging fruit where possible and to use intimidation tactics to try to scare out other concessions where possible. And then I think they're going to try to move on to other things. Europe is in talks of a coalition of the willing. Who do you think would be most likely to give Ukraine a security guarantee? With France losing its position in Africa from Russia, could France play a substantial role in Ukraine's security to get back at Russia? I don't think anything France does in Ukraine is going to be done to get back at Russia, because that's not really how governments think. If Russia were a more substantive strategic threat, maybe retaliation of some kind would be in order there, but I don't think France sees Russia as overly threatening. A threat, yes, but not so much so that it wants to go hard on West Africa. I would also point out that France was pushed out of West Africa not so much by Russia, so much as by regional nationalists. Certainly Russia exacerbated it through various means. But by and large, it was an organic evolution of relations between West Africans and France. Relations have never been especially good. As the region has democratized, more skeptical populists have gotten into power, specifically those skeptical of France and French influence. And maybe the most damning development was the French military assistance designed to fight insurgents in West Africa has largely been ineffective over the past 10 years, or at least it has not been effective enough to meet the expectations of indigenous polities. So the result is that France's credibility in the region has cratered, and eventually they started looking for alternatives, and one of the main alternatives ended up being Russia. Again, Russia helped that process along where it could, but I think it would be inaccurate to say that they pushed the French out of West Africa. I don't think Russia was really capable of doing that. Who do I think would be most likely to give Ukraine a security guarantee? I think everybody is pretty much equally likely to give them a security guarantee if they know that everybody else is going to do it too. And I speak here in terms of Europe when I say everybody. If there's confidence among European states that a security guarantee would be given by Western Europe as a whole, well, not just Western Europe, but sort of the European Union / NATO, that Europe, if everybody agreed to do it at the same time, I think then there would be a lot more willingness, even among relatively skeptical states, to actually do it. As is, it's being negotiated more on a bilateral basis. Proponents of aid to Ukraine are trying to push more of a multilateral approach that gets everybody on board, but there's enough skeptics like Hungary, for example, that this has proven difficult and slow. And so individual countries that are the most pro-Ukraine have kind of been operating more on their own. But this in turn limits the viability of a broader security guarantee by the whole continent. So among the most pro-Ukraine countries right now are the UK, France, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and maybe, did I already say Denmark?
Yes.
I think I did, okay. And I think the Netherlands has been relatively pro, but I haven't heard as much from them lately.
Chat's asking
Everybody
Turkey.
else, sorry?
Chat's asking Turkey.
This is not really European, per se. The question specifically Well, I inferred was talking mostly about Europe. The question started with Europe is in talks. In so much as Turkey is a part of Europe, then maybe Turkey. Turkey's whole modus operandi vis-a-vis the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, whatever you want to call it, has been to play both sides and benefit from both sides. A security guarantee would be very forward in favor of one side at the expense of Russia. And I don't know if they would be willing to risk the benefits they get from Russia by being ambiguous, that would invariably be incurred by deploying a peace contingent into Ukraine. Maybe Moscow would be okay with that. If that were the case, I think it would be much more likely. Or maybe if Ukraine were able to kind of buy Turkish support with some kind of set of concessions, maybe then Erdogan would be willing to play ball. He's a very transactional guy, after all. But I think it might be hard for Ukraine to outbid Turkey for that. To outbid Russia for Turkish participation and assistance in that regard. Maybe with European help, they could outbid Russia for that. But regardless, there almost certainly would be a bidding process. I'm very skeptical the Turkish government would do that on its own. They've sent some signals diplomatically that they would be willing to consider it, but nothing concrete as of yet. And I would point out that it's very easy for Turkey to make promises that are going to make them popular with Europe that don't actually require them to do anything in the short term. That's easy diplomatic capital for them. But yeah, I think those would be... Sorry?
Is Germany pro-Ukraine?
Yes, they are fairly pro-Ukraine, but there's a lot of resistance within certain quarters of the German political spectrum to getting substantively more involved. That was one of the things that held back the previous chancellor, Scholz. You know, he at times announced big, bold plans, but also he rarely followed them up, and he generally had to come under a lot of pressure from allies to step up assistance. The Taurus missile was one such example. The Taurus is a cruise missile developed by Germany. The Ukrainians wanted it. The Scholz government said, yeah, we'll give that to you maybe later after considerable consideration. And it basically wasn't until the United States and Britain started openly giving equivalent munitions to Ukraine that the German government ended up kind of changing its mind. So yes, pro-Ukraine, but they're kind of on the fence. I think the German government is probably more pro-Ukrainian than the broader German polity at this point. And I think that's the principal block to further German participation.
Cool.
Where's the tariff money going? What's the presidency doing with the money? For now, collecting it. I don't know specifically what the rules are for that, if they have to just save all the money for a given year and then allocate it in the next year, or if the government just takes it and spends it on whatever the fuck. But as far as what the president plans to do with the money, he said in the past that he wants to use it to pay for the tax cuts that he wants to renew. I would point out that there's no way there's going to be enough tariff revenue to cover those tax cuts, but that seems to be what he has in mind. Beyond that, I don't know. Maybe stolen? Wouldn't put it past the current administration. There's been lots of other shenanigans going on. But yeah, the real answer there is I don't know. And I don't know that anybody really does at this point. Argentina is taking another loan with the IMF for $20 billion. Not a question, just letting me know. Yeah, I did see that. I saw that news item. There's a couple articles from the past couple weeks I haven't read yet, specifically about some changes. I think Argentina dropped foreign currency control. I can't remember if it was capital controls or currency controls, one or the other. But they dropped them, and that is going to have probably pretty dramatic effects. I did get an email from Dagnep updating me on what's going on there beyond just the $20 billion for the IMF. And as usual, politics in Argentina are very colorful. He's very pessimistic about the course Argentina is on. I'm at least a little bit optimistic because I think even if it's extremely painful in the short term, there is potential for the Argentine private sector to recover and get back on a positive growth trajectory, which I think would be good for everybody. I know it's very controversial what what's his face Malay is doing, and I think he's had some missteps. But in general, the macroeconomic conditions seem to be getting better, inflation notwithstanding. I would certainly welcome criticism from Dagmip and other Argentines on that point. And I need to read more. I'm a bit rusty on Argentine politics right now because I've been trying to follow all of the stupid shit happening in my own country, which is very time consuming.
Quick question from chat. What's your favorite StarCraft 2 race?
Terran.
Okay.
Easily.
Did you play through all the campaigns?
Oh, yeah.
Nice.
I mean, for me, the original StarCraft is what really got me into it, because I really loved, especially the Terran campaign in the first StarCraft game, was basically just a live action remake. Was not a live. It basically gave you a chance to kind of act out all of the famous sci-fi movies from the 80s and 90s that I loved growing up. I really appreciated all of the subtle references to them. So I thought that was very cool. I thought the sort of low-key horror theme was very cool. And so the first campaign, the Terran campaign in the first game, really epitomized that. That's what I loved about StarCraft the most. The other campaigns didn't do that as much, so I didn't like them as much. And then StarCraft 2 kind of got away from that entirely. It kind of got away from, referencing other cool science fiction properties and tried to do its own thing. And I didn't entirely like the direction they took. So for me, the first Terran campaign is the big one for me that kept me with StarCraft. And so that correspondingly means that Terran is my favorite race. Also, just role play. If you like that kind of thing, it's easier to role play as the Terrans. You can be the humans trying to survive against insurmountable, undefeatable alien foes, and it's fun for me.
Cool. Well, I'm obviously a Zerg.
I suspected.
Someone asked me recently what made me switch to Zerg, because I actually started as a Protoss in Wings of Liberty. I didn't play StarCraft 1 at all, really, so StarCraft 2 is the first introduction to the franchise. And I thought Protoss looked cool, so I started with those. But there was a Protoss from our, actually, UTD StarCraft club who was High Master, and he was the best one at the club. His name was Wei. And he would make Dark Templar, which are the invisible dudes, and just kill everybody. It's really hard to have detection on time and to remember to do that when he could also like poke you with Stalker and Zealot at the start. So most players that early on in SC2, they would fumble against his Stalker Zealot pressure, and then they would die to his DTs. And my friend Naven, we actually played a bunch of WoW together and got Gladiator. He was a Diamond Zerg. And so it was a disadvantage matchup for him, but we're in the computer lab for the StarCraft club, and Naven Niduses the main base of Wei and gets a whole bunch of Roach Hydra up there with an Overseer, so his DTs can't do stuff and he can't really defend himself because it's not at his wall off. And after I saw that, I was like, man, Zerg is heckin' amazing with the tools that it has, and it's very different than the other factions. I also really like the way that Muta macro kind of flows. Another one of my friends, Tommy, he would play Mass Muta, and it just looked really cool, flying around and getting a whole bunch of harass damage and keeping your units alive and that kind of thing. So probably those two styles really seemed cool to me and made me want to play Zerg. I also like the like mental unison of the Zerg, because they have one mission and one purpose, and they kind of see each other as one overarching organism. They're a lot less selfish, and they don't fight amongst each other as much. At least the swarm doesn't. So it's kind of a cool concept of everyone working together for a common cause and kind of feeling the same emotions and thoughts together. Is pretty cool. And I like Kerrigan, well-designed character.
You've got a type.
Yeah. Protoss campaign in SC2 is super duper epic, and it's really fun that it includes some Terran missions, some Zerg missions, and some Protoss missions. So regardless of which one is your favorite, there's some good stuff for you in the final campaign for Legacy of the Void, which I like a lot. The difficulty ratings for the three of these for SC2, The Terran campaign, some argue, is the hardest for the last mission. It's a really hard mission. The Zerg campaign is really easy compared to the other ones. And then the Protoss campaign does have quite a few super hard missions. Probably more super hard missions than the Terran campaign, but maybe not the hardest mission. Depends on who you ask. Yeah, random StarCraft banter there.
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've played, but I do still enjoy it. Every once in a blue moon, I'll do a co-op thing.
Mm-hmm.
Generally badly. But that has been fun in the past. That's probably the most I've done with StarCraft in a while. I actually did, if you want to do a StarCraft anecdote, I'll exchange StarCraft anecdotes with you. Me and my friends actually did play the StarCraft board game when we were in college. Many, many moons ago. Fun game. I was trash at it, but it was fun.
Nice. I didn't even know that existed.
Oh, there's board games for everything now. There was a Civilization board game back in the day. Played it a couple times. The setup takes a long time for sophisticated board games, and it kind of acts as a deterrent. You want to play them, but at the same time, you don't want to spend an hour setting up, an hour cleaning up. And some of the bigger ones can take like 9 hours to play or whatever.
Yeah. Have you heard of Kingdom Death? That's a board
game. You told
game.
me about that.
Yeah, that's what my friend Apoptosis plays. He has the whole, well, not the whole set, but you buy different expansions to it. So I don't know what the total value of the game that he has is, but it has huge models, really detailed, artful books, like a card system for different items that you collect. It's got a lot of different parts to it, so it takes, like you're saying, about an hour to set up. And then a session could go for, like, a campaign could be broken up over multiple sessions, and that could take, I don't know, 30 to 50 hours. So it's a very high investment game, and you use a phone app to track the stats of your characters and stuff. So whenever you're setting everything up again, you know how to get back to your previous game state. So it kind of helps you save your progress. Super cool game, super expensive to be able to have all the parts of it, but it does feel really rewarding to play, and it feels closer to Dungeons and Dragons in terms of the depth of immersion and story, just because of how much lore is in the content. The models let you see what you're working with in a really cool way, and then the system for combat does involve a lot of skill in both positioning and preparation, and kind of choosing what you do on the battlefield. So great game, completely impractical to play. I don't have a set here myself, so I will only ever play this if I go to his place in Seattle, but it's one of those board games that's hyper complex but really fun if you have the right group for it.
Awesome.
Yeah. If I get in Texas, we should do something to chill. Like, I don't know, Settlers of Catan is kind of like a light version of that sort of thing, where it is a strategic game, but it doesn't take too long to set up. It does have decent banter about it because people are trying to trade stuff. So I like that one.
I would be down for that.
Yeah.
I would 100% be down for that. I would also be 100% down if we meet here to give you the gift I got you in China in 2019.
Okay, that was 6 years ago.
I've still got it. I'm going to give it to you someday.
That's okay. You're storing it for me.
There you go.
Thank you for your storage. Well, cool.
Let's see.
We're at
about
about
a couple more. Do you want to blow through them, or do you want to save them for next time?
if it's a couple more, you can get them.
All right. Has Congress passed any actual laws, policy since the election, or has all this nonsense been purely executive orders? The vast majority has been executive orders. I actually read in chat last time that one of the laws passed was the Lycan-Riley Act, which I'd totally forgotten about, which basically just sets higher sentences for immigrants who have been convicted of crimes. I don't remember specifically the details, but something to that effect. Beyond that, though, there really has not been a lot of legislative activity out of Congress. The reason for that is that they've been mostly focused on the budget. They've been trying to negotiate a budget bill / budget resolution, And the negotiations for that have been very contentious and have taken up everybody's political capital. Let's see. What's your take on Trump admin revoking the temporary protected status for Afghanis that fled the country after the U.S. withdrawal? I mean, in general, it's just sad. I mean, lots of people would like to be here who helped the United States during the conflict and who are in danger. Not allowing them to come and forcing the ones already here to leave. Just, I don't know. I don't get the point of that. Doesn't seem to really benefit anybody, especially. So I have to assume the administration just wants to do it to score some political points, to say that they're getting immigrants out of the U.S. But yeah, again, it doesn't add up to me. But that's a political thing. As we've said on here before, I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm not your mother. I'm not going to tell you to support this, suppose that. You can kind of make up your own mind. We try to stick with the facts, and I try to kind of give commentary on stuff to try to give you context. Let's see. Are these trade deficits, these tariffs, based on factoring in U.S. tourism dollars spent in these countries? Some of these tariff percentages sound weird as fuck. They do not. The trade deficit that is used to calculate the tariffs is purely based on trade in goods. It does not include at all flows in services. So streaming services, for example, financial flows, tourism, anything like that is not included in the current account balance, which is what they're looking at when they calculate trade deficits in goods. If you look at the reserve account, or the total balance of payments, which incorporates both reserve account and current accounts, and it looks different. It looks much different. The U.S. is still in deficit in that case, but not by nearly as large a margin. So once you throw in services, trade is much more balanced. That's actually one of the items I'm going to talk a little bit about when I get to the critique section in, God help us, part 3 of the tariff series we're doing. So short answer, no. How is Trump's on, off again tariffs not direct market manipulation? It depends on intent. If he's doing this specifically to manipulate markets and make money, then yes, that is obviously direct market manipulation. But if it's not that, if he's just doing it to try to shore up leverage by scaring the rest of the world, or if it's just an organic process of starting with a big bombastic announcement and then having lobbyists kind of talk you down and give individual exemptions over time, in that case, the intent is not market manipulation. It's just something else. It's maybe dumb, but it is, how would you call it? Earnest. They are making an earnest effort and just making changes on the fly without really caring about the market. I'm sure if they ended up in court, that's what they would probably end up arguing, regardless. But as of yet, I don't think there's enough evidence to confidently say that it's, oh yeah, definitely market manipulation. I guess it's worth pointing out, too, that the Trump administration making an earnest effort to change the balance of trade, challenge the rest of the world to this trade confrontation, is not necessarily mutually exclusive with taking advantage of that to make money. It could be both. In fact, it probably is both, honestly. That would be my guess. But I don't think, as the question implies, that this is the reason that they're doing this. I don't think market manipulation is the secret motivation here for all of this tariff drama. That's the last question.
Good job. Chat asks, is it legal to tweet buy stocks now?
To tweet what?
Buy stocks now.
Oh, is it? Oh, yeah. I would imagine.
Okay.
Wait, the question is it legal to buy stocks now?
To tweet. For Trump to tweet buy stocks now.
Oh, for Trump. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I could have specified that.
Is it legal for Trump to tweet?
No sweat for any of us to do it. We're not influencing much.
Okay. Again, it depends on intent. Like if that was done specifically for a pump and dump, then yes. If it was done to try to get his supporters to do it so that they could make money, so that he could politically benefit, probably yes, that still counts as market manipulation. If he was just doing it to be obnoxious or to get attention or whatever, then no. In that case, he's just being his usual irascible self.
Fancy word, irascible. Cool.
I do try. You got to use the big words or lose them, Neuro.
Yeah, that's true. Thank you for expanding our minds. Irascible. Well, cool. Thank you for Tariffs Part 2, and thank you, chat, for weighing in and fuzzy cord friendly questions. We will see you all in the next episode of Whale Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks again. Always a privilege. Talk to you next time.
GG.